power. So not only do we not have a price penalty, but on top of that, we actually reward unreliable power by giving them special subsidies. So we're actually paying extra for unreliable power. It's just totally insane, and it's part of the reason why we have a crisis. So we need to get rid of those subsidies. So we need to get rid of, I believe, all the IRA subsidies, but in particular what are called the clean electricity ones that dramatically favor unreliable solar and wind. Those are the most deadly ones that Congress needs to eliminate immediately, whether it's through reconciliation or something else. And then finally, on top of all this restriction of the supply, we're artificially increasing demand through forced electrification. So things like forced EVs, forced heat pumps. Again, when we have a shortage of supply and we have a lot of organic demand from AI, it is absolutely insane and unconscionable to mandate new demand from EVs and from heat pumps that people don't want and aren't willing to pay for on a free market. So as I said at the outset, our crisis is simple. We are artificially restricting supply. We're artificially increasing demand. The solution is fundamentally simple: unleash supply, end forced electrification, end forced demand. In practice, this requires a lot of very little steps. So I have dozens of these in my testimony, and very happy to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to help in any way I can, because we want to go right now from electricity crisis to electricity abundance, and we can do it, but it's going to take some very dramatic actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Epstein. I now recognize Ms. Gunasekara for her opening statement. I hope I got your name right.
You did.
Thank you.
Quite well. Chairman Burleson, Ranking Member Frost, members of the subcommittee, it really is wonderful to be here with y'all. I appreciate the invitation today to discuss the opportunity to create a future of energy abundance, improved reliability, and lower energy costs to the benefit of American families. The subcommittee's efforts to create this future of abundance, it's critical to economic growth, grid stability, as well as stabilizing everyday cost. Over the last 4 years, Americans had to suffer the consequences of an administration that sought to constrain traditional energy development, mainly coal, oil, and natural gas that still provide 80% of our daily energy needs, and force second-rate technologies onto the American people. I've testified to this before, and I think it's worth repeating, that many of the policies put forward in the last administration were fundamentally against American energy development, and they made the necessities of life a financial burden. We must not continue these same policy mistakes. For example, from January 21 throughout the following 4 years, Americans saw energy prices skyrocket. From heating oil to electricity, natural gas, they all became untenable. And as a result, 1 in 6 American families have been behind on their utility bills for many, many years. The cost of average household rose around $10,000, significantly straining budgets. And low-income Americans also struggled in especially critical ways. In some cases, they would choose to go without food, medical care, or prescriptions simply to make ends meet because of this rising cost of energy. Now, these hardships, among many others, are why energy policy was a key focus of the recent election. There is a critical need for reliable, affordable energy, and we know how to deliver this need in the United States better than any other country. President Trump understands this, as do the majority of the American people that have entrusted him to once again deliver on the promise of American energy dominance and support the America First policies necessary to actually achieve it. This includes addressing aging infrastructure that led to inefficiencies and increased outages throughout the country. Alex was talking about Epstein, I should say. I got Herrgott and Epstein. But he was talking about this. While this issue, it certainly has received a lot of attention, especially in this House, the policies aimed at addressing it have missed the mark. Rolling brownouts and blackouts have become much more common across America. In 2023, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, one of the agencies responsible for assessing reliability in this country, listed, quote, energy policy as a leading risk to electric reliability for the first time. Commonly cited were policies that shifted resources away from investing and upgrading existing infrastructure and towards fruitless net zero goals and Green New Deal policies. The most recent 2024 report reiterated these same issues, characterizing many energy regions at, quote, high risk of resource adequacy shortfalls over the next decade. Now, the good news, I would say, is that Congress can shift the energy policy back towards what will actually work. They can cut unnecessary red tape, streamline the permitting process, address a growing energy imbalance that has been the result of an over-reliance and forced shift towards renewables like wind and solar, while fast-tracking the closure of baseload generation from coal, natural gas, and even nuclear. Now, in my written testimony, I listed out a number of policy recommendations. I would like to highlight just a few that I think are important to discuss with regard to today's hearings. One is accepting the reality that fossil fuels provide the bulk of energy that we use every day, and that energy use is expected to grow for a variety of reasons. Instead of working to ban or constrain their use, we should support efforts to make them cleaner and more efficient, not shut them down. Also, protect the foundation of the grid. What I'm referring to is ensuring baseload energy, which is the most important in terms of stabilization and cost, that we protect those. Policy leaders must consider a way, or I would suggest they consider ways to account for the value of baseload energy, especially with on-site fuel storage that can withstand supply chain disruptions we know are inevitable in this space at some point. Also, ensure that grid reliability or resiliency standards are technology neutral, so grid operators and engineers have the flexibility to plan for and respond to major swings in demand that, again, we know are inevitable in this space. Establishing balanced environmental standards. There's a lot of work already ongoing at the US EPA, but ensuring that standards are based on proven, not prospective timelines. They take cost in consideration and have flexible timelines for compliance. Also, I think this is really important and something that's often overlooked, prioritizing mining in America. Incentivize domestic manufacturing of all energy technologies and the domestic mining of minerals that go into these technologies. I think approving the Twin Metals mine in northeastern Minnesota would be a very important and effective, good first step. Also, being open to new innovative technologies. One that I talk a lot about is the role of Bitcoin miners in stabilizing grids. There's a lot of opportunities and new innovations, and considering those would be very important. Again, I thank you for your attention to this important policy. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Gunasekara. I now recognize Mr. Herrgott for his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Burleson and Ranking Member Frost. My name is Alex Herrgott, and I'm president of the Permian Institute. Since 2021, TPI has operated as a nonpartisan, nonprofit trade association. Our members and partners constitute the largest developers in the United States, who all collectively support the common goal of accelerating infrastructure improvement across all sectors: conventional, renewable energy, transportation, water, pipelines, mining, manufacturing, ports, water, broadband. We believe the uncertainties of election cycles, divisive permitting policy battles, and the prioritization of infrastructure sectors and energy sources are largely unnecessary distractions. These distractions put hundreds of billions of dollars in current private sector investment at constant risk of lengthy delays and project abandonment, driving up energy and household good costs and ultimately weakening our global competitiveness. This situation is unsustainable for all Americans, regardless of political affiliation. There's hundreds of billions of private sector investment that remains on the sidelines, and mayors and governors who are committing billions of taxpayer revenue 20 years out in the future. The inconvenient truth is that for nearly a decade, Congress's legislative efforts to address this problem have fallen short. Opponents of more aggressive changes to permitting laws often fail to recognize that every project that disturbs the earth, impacts habitats, or alters landscapes creates unavoidable interactions with nature. It doesn't matter if it's offshore wind, transmission, wind, solar, hydrogen, it all falls under the same 60 environmental laws that we can't get out of our own way on. These interactions trigger hundreds of reviews and regulations governing infrastructure permits at the federal, state, and local levels. Over the last decade, Congress has reached consensus on various process reforms aimed at achieving greater coordination and efficiency, but has left untouched the statutory provisions, some over 100 years old. These temporary fixes fail to address the underlying issues. One of the major issues is transparency. In 2025, President Biden's Council of Environmental Quality released a report claiming it reduced the median time for agencies to complete environmental review statements from 3.1 to 2.4 years. The administration touted that this is a 23% improvement over Trump's first term. However, this is just not accurate. My members must have missed the memo on that, because the problem is getting worse, not better. Typically, TPI refrains from engaging in debates about the appropriate size and scope of federal infrastructure initiatives. However, given the trillions in unprecedented debt spending that have already been incurred, obligating future generations of American taxpayers to rebuild our infrastructure, only to rebuild it again with their own money 30, 40 years from now, not addressing permitting amounts to legislative malpractice. Our broken system allows agencies to sit on applications for years and decades in case with no certainty of eventual project approval or any response at all. TPI does not claim that federal agencies owe project developers a yes, but we owe them an answer in an appropriate amount of time. Once in the process, developers, even today, find themselves in the dark, uncertain of where their projects stand along the concurrent permitting pathways with various federal agencies. Over the past several years, some federal agencies have developed new informal and formal gardens, partly due to the requirements for 2-year average timelines. These policies front-load biological, cultural, and historical survey requirements before the formal review process begins, pushing the official starting point even further into the future. See my comments earlier about CEQ's manipulation of the statistical relevance of the data. Even with the recent federal funding, more than 95% of major U.S. investments in energy are entirely supported by the private sector. Infrastructure investors require predictability, yet they are often treated as adversaries in conflict with federal regulators rather than partners in rebuilding the nation. We can't get out of our own way. Without a systematic shift in how we address permitting in the United States, federal and state courts will increasingly take on the role of interpreting appropriate application of administrative and procedural roles and rendering science-based decisions on behalf of the agencies. This cannot be the way forward. Congress must address both permitting process reform and litigation reform. While necessary litigation reform is necessary, without the underlying permitting reform, we are only addressing the symptom and not the root cause. Despite a bipartisan desire to tackle these existential issues, pressure from vocal stakeholders on both sides and a political tendency to avoid risk perpetuates the status quo, leaving lawmakers searching for superficial fixes. With a load growth that for the last 20 years has been 1% year over year and is about to jump to 20%, there is going to be plenty of blame going around in the House and the Senate. Blame is going to metastasize, yet at the very core of it is the issue that we can fix now before the issue becomes untenable. Both Republicans and Democrats support large-scale energy projects, including transmission, wind, natural gas, solar, critical minerals, hydro, carbon capture, and hydrogen. Energy shortages, price instability, and supply constraints, and increased construction costs contribute to the human, environmental, and financial cost of these delays. With each passing month, the window for solutions continues to shrink, and the cost of living in America rises. Despite these challenges, I'm optimistic that we can make progress this year and in the years to come. There are glimmers of hope as the proverbial strange bedfellows find common cause. Before looking at the actions as President Trump and the executive orders as something that is to be scoffed at, we must look at the fact that we need to break down the system and change the paradigm and rebuild it in a rational way, in the way in which the real world actually works, not relying on laws that were written more than 100 years ago, many 30 years before the internet, to govern the way that we build infrastructure and put billions and billions into a system that doesn't serve American purposes. A project development cycle of 7 to 10 years is simply too long. By working together, we can advance permitting reforms to build a 21st century infrastructure that safeguards communities, protects the cultural resources, and creates jobs and brings prosperity to every corner of America. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Cleetus for her opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Chairman Burleson, Ranking Member Frost, and members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing. My name is Rachel Cleetus. I'm the Policy Director for the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We're a nonpartisan science advocacy organization. I want to leave you with 3 things today. One is that our transition of our electric system to one that's modernized, more flexible, with more renewables and storage is the best way to protect consumer costs as well as safeguard health, make sure that we're competitive on the global stage and that we're innovating as we go along. There are tremendous economic and health benefits from this transition. Number 2, doubling down on fossil fuels is harmful. It's taking us in exactly the wrong direction. And actually, there is ample evidence that natural gas price volatility is one of the factors driving increased electricity prices as well as reliability concerns in the power grid. And number 3, in 2025, we should not ask any American to choose between their health and prosperity. We can have both, and we should have both. And here's how we can do it. Ramping up renewable energy, energy efficiency, and storage, investing in a modernized, more resilient electric grid will help cut power bills, they'll boost business opportunities, and improve public health. Meanwhile, if we double down on fossil fuels, all we're doing is serving to promote the profits of fossil fuel companies at the expense of the American public. Renewable energy is now the dominant source of new power generation capacity because, frankly, in many parts of the country, it's the cheapest source, and we can bring it online quickly. Last year, renewables and battery storage accounted for 94% of all new large-scale capacity, with solar and battery storage leading the charge. In 2025 and 2026, solar generation we're going to get about 25% of our electricity generation from renewables, and solar generation is expected to jump 45% between 2024 and 2026. The Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provide critical funding to accelerate this clean energy transition, and it's benefiting communities across the country in red states and blue states. It's helping expand access to clean, affordable energy, building domestic manufacturing and supply chains, creating good-paying jobs, and helping limit pollution from fossil fuels. In the last year, U.S. investments in clean technologies reached $272 billion. That's crucial to keeping our businesses competitive in a world where greener products are increasingly in demand. The current administration's actions to claw back or freeze this funding is frankly unfathomable. It is creating a disruption and market uncertainty for businesses that are trying to lean into opportunities right now. It's going to cede leadership on technology advancement. It's going to cut jobs, and ultimately it's going to harm electric reliability and increase energy costs. Trying to boost fossil fuels and turn back the clock, that's the exact opposite direction. We're a nation that embraces modernizing. We're a nation that embraces innovation. Let's embrace the future and not get stuck in the past. A rush to further expand LNG exports is only going to exacerbate price risk to consumers. Recent extreme weather events underscore that gas power plants face significant reliability concerns, with many catastrophic failures occurring during winter. Worsening heat waves, wildfires, drought are also putting pressure on the grid. And what we find is that hybrid systems that couple renewable energy with storage provide significant grid reliability services. For example, during the heat domes that we saw last year and the year before, in the Texas grid, it was solar plus storage that helped save the day. The power sector does need to plan for increased demand, but the way to do that is manage and plan that demand growth to align with expansion of clean energy. We already are at record fossil fuel highs, whether it comes to oil or LNG. There is no problem in terms of expansion of fossil fuels, unfortunately, even as the climate crisis worsens. What we need to do is unleash clean, renewable power, the transmission to go with it, and energy efficiency. The grid is desperately in need of upgrades and expansion. It's got a C- grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers. During extreme weather and climate events, we've seen power outages that affect millions, cost billions of dollars in damages. We do need to quickly expand investments in a resilient transmission system built for the future climate conditions that scientists are telling us are going to worsen. We can integrate higher levels of renewables, provide reliability benefits, reduce bills, reduce pollution. Modernizing the power sector also provides opportunities to clean up air, water, and soil pollution. That's a critical factor that communities around the country are depending on us for, especially communities that are overburdened by pollution today. We need to target investments in those communities so that they too can reap the benefits of a more affordable, cleaner, modern energy system. Burning fossil fuels is the primary driver of human-caused climate change, which is already exerting a fearsome toll around the country. We can sharply cut heat-trapping emissions while delivering billions of dollars in consumer energy savings and public health benefits. So modernizing and cleaning up the power sector is vital for the economy, for us to compete globally, and it's the best way to protect reliability in consumers' pocketbooks. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Epstein, in my home state of Missouri, we rely predominantly on coal for electricity generation. The previous administration's proposed regulation on power plants would lead to the premature closure of fossil fuel-fired power plants across the country, including Missouri. And I'll tell you, I had a sobering moment during Winter Storm Uri, when we had 2 weeks of negative, double-digit temperature. And we were hearing about reliability problems. They were warning of brownouts. They were warning that they may have to shut down power. And the heating of our own personal home was barely keeping up. And I'll tell you, looking out the window of my backyard and seeing that we had a coal-fired power plant that was going, I was thankful to God that we had that at that time. Unfortunately, some people died in Winter Storm Uri, 150 people. So this is very sobering. It's very real. My question is, how should Congress and the new Trump administration address misguided regulations to ensure that Americans in every district have access to affordable, reliable electricity supplies and never face having to freeze to death in modern America?
I mean, first of all, they really, and in particular, let's focus on EPA, they really need to recognize what you're saying, which is that a reliable grid is an existential thing for human life, including human health. I think, we heard an example about like, oh, what if you put a natural gas plant and it's going to harm people's health? That's pseudoscience. Natural gas burns incredibly cleanly. But what does harm people's health is not having a reliable natural gas plant. Imagine not having reliable natural gas in Florida, not having coal in Missouri. Like these, cold is the #1 cause of climate-related death, despite people are afraid of warming. Like the EPA, when it's doing cost-benefit analyses, which it needs to do more of, and Congress should make it do more of, it needs to factor in the reliability of the grid as a crucial factor. And one thing I know you and I have talked about is there should just be a pause on any kind of new action that potentially threatens the reliability of the grid until the electricity crisis is resolved, because the electricity crisis is a health crisis that far dwarfs any negative side effects of fossil fuels.
And with new power demands coming, with, as you mentioned, the AI data centers and all of that, what can we do now to prepare and to ramp up quickly?
I mean, I was just sighing because I'm like, listen to people like me 10 years ago. I mean, it's annoying because it was so obvious that shutting down reliable power plants in a world that could need more reliable electricity was just a disaster. So I think what you need to look at is what are the near-term things you can do. I think the most near-term thing you can do, which I didn't cover in my testimony, is you want to see how do we increase the already existing capacity of coal plants and natural gas plants, which particularly with the coal plants is being drastically underutilized due to a lot of irrational emissions regulations. Like coal and gas have real capacity, solar and wind have fake capacity. It's not a capacity if you can go to near zero at any given time when the weather changes. So you need to increase the utilization of our real capacity, and happy to share more details on how to do that.
Thank you. Ms. Gunasekara, as the chief, the former chief of staff at EPA, you had a unique perspective on how federal agencies work or do not work. When thinking about the role of the federal government and how it has in encouraging economic growth, how do the regulations stand in the way of that economic growth?
Yeah, I think what we saw in the last administration was putting their thumb on the scale against traditional energy resources, coal, oil, and natural gas that, again, provide the bulk of our daily energy needs and then also provide that important baseload generation that I referenced earlier. When you have overregulation, it increased costs, it increased litigation opportunities, and that equates to uncertainty throughout various industries that are necessary for us to live out our daily modern lives. So really paring back various regulations that have either skewed from EPA's actual mission, which is to protect the environment, improve efficiencies, not put certain businesses out of business, to get away from that, to comport with the law and ensure that there's stability and certainty going forward for those that want to make the investments we need to meet this future growth in energy demand.
Thank you. And Mr. Herrgott, what recommendations do you have to address the problems in the current permitting system, and what's at stake if we do not?
So as an example, as much as the IRA is touted as a marquee accomplishment of the last administration, there were 195 new regulations, 45 gigs of wind, solar transmission, and others that would have provided for the green energy revolution are either abandoned or will never get built. So the reality is, when capital is put at risk, we remove the obstacles and build it well within a year. We can do that. Countries far greener than ours in Europe do it in half the time that we do it, without any compromises to environmental or social or cultural protections. We are in the modern age. We are relying on 50-year-old rules on how we build infrastructure, and if we continue on this pathway of not realizing that there is a balance between human activity and the natural environment. If you want a car, you're going to need a road. If you want to turn on your lights, you're going to need a transmission line. If you're not going to build the renewable energy, you need to rely on the other stuff. At some point, electricity is not a public good. At some point, it has to get built. And the government is not going to build it. The private sector is. We got to remove the hurdles. And we also need to look at opportunities to potentially outsource engineering and architects firms to address the significant backload of projects that are moving through the system with a federal workforce that is not capable to deal with the complexity of the projects of today.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Frost for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Herrgott, how can home solar and home energy storage contribute to Americans' energy needs and grid resilience?
So it can play a role as an intermittent source to offset the cost of energy, or to provide, at some points, a payback of distributed generation back to the utilities. But on average, it is not going to make a dramatic difference. In particular, with the 20% load growth that we're going to see year over year, it almost becomes a least economical way to put the solar panels on a house with the transmission that would then have to reverse back into the utility. There's a far better way to address. If the goal is for zero carbon emission projects, there is a far more efficient way to do it. We have to stop pretending that these things that are of a smaller scale are somehow going to address a larger problem.
And how can energy resilience programs for single-family homes contribute to people keeping their lights on during extreme weather? This is, this is a big deal in the state of Florida as well, and part of the reason why it's a pretty bipartisan issue we've seen on home rooftop solar and people wanting to become energy independent within their own home.
So the cost of energy is oftentimes, and the cost of these 20 to 30% it takes to build a project is often passed down to the ratepayer. It becomes this intangible cost that is spread over many ratepayers, so we don't see that the kilowatt per hour goes up a half a cent a year or half a cent a month. Because we're not transparent about how that project actually gets from generation to the house, the cost increase is because, to give you an example, there were 5 to 6 large-scale renewable transmission lines that were almost permitted at the end of the Trump administration, and Cardinal Hickory Creek, 10 West, and many others, that still took another 3 to 4 years. If we can't build the infrastructure, if we can't build the new KV lines to get from 115 to 230 to 530 that actually reduce cost and efficiencies, then what are we doing here?
Dr. Cleetus, as the only economist among our witnesses today, how confident are you in Trump's promise to cut energy costs in half in the next 500 days?
If that promise is predicated on what we've seen in the last month, I fear not at all. That promise will not be met. And unfortunately, in the interim, many people around the country are going to suffer from higher energy costs, lost jobs. Businesses are suffering from uncertainty in the marketplace. This is actually really taking the economy in the wrong direction. So I hope there will be a reversal of some of those early day announcements.
Yeah, and I want to get an idea of how abandoning our clean energy future will actually mean higher bills for folks. I mean, number one, there's nothing worse for your bank account than completely losing your job. And a lot of these executive orders are aiming to abandon clean energy investments and projects. I actually, agree with what Mr. Herrgott said as well, in terms of if we've already made this investment to begin something, when we abandon it, I would say we're misusing a lot of taxpayer money, and we're not going the direction we need to go into. But abandoning these clean energy investment means that Americans are going to lose their jobs. And I've spoken with trades really around the country, but especially in my district, people who are at work right now because of these investments we've made. How could that harm America's clean energy leadership moving forward?
The reality is we are on the cusp of what could have been an incredible evolution, and we can still capture that bright future if we continue to make these investments. The Inflation Reduction Act has only been a couple of years into implementation, and already we've seen hundreds of thousands of jobs, so many manufacturing facilities in the Southeast, all around the country. That is an incredible opportunity for the communities that live there, and that's why there's bipartisan support. We've seen letters sent to the Speaker from the Republican side as well, saying, please don't stop these investments because they're helping drive jobs and innovation. When we look at the world of the future, it's moving towards a clean energy world. The U.S. should be at the forefront of that technological revolution. Let's not cut ourselves out.
What states would be mostly impacted?
Well, if we look at the states that are getting the investments right now, there are places like Alabama, there are places like Kentucky, there are places in the Southeast that are they're getting on a percentage basis a much greater amount of these investments. They've built battery plants, they've built EV manufacturing. So these clean energy jobs are everywhere in the country, but some parts of the country had been lagging, and they're now getting a chance to take advantage of this incredible opportunity.
Yeah, I appreciate bringing that up. I mean, and globally, in terms of being a global player, we get most of our energy from oil. And part of the purpose of moving towards this new green economy and clean energy, of course, is cutting emissions because of the climate crisis, but also having more diversity in our energy mix, which is important for resiliency as well, and lowering costs. So thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
In regard to the cost of renewables versus hydrocarbon resources, I just want to point out that The Economist magazine reported that between November 2022 and February 2023, they estimate there are 140,000 plus excess winter deaths because these people just couldn't afford to adequately heat their homes. And as Mr. Epstein pointed out, there are more people die from coal-related illnesses than from heat. So while there are people out there that are trying to save the planet with misguided energy policies that undermine our national security, China is working every day to dominate the planet. Mr. Epstein, can we compete with China in the development and utilization of artificial intelligence with renewable power only?
I mean, with renewable power only, we can't compete with Ghana.
Would you agree that we are in a technology arms race with China for dominance in AI and quantum computing?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so scary because, I was writing my book Fossil Future in like 2020, and this was just so clearly going to happen. So I had a section on AI, way back then. And it's just, this is clearly an existential thing. I mean, I use these technologies so much in my own work already, and they're just so driven by the ability to have on-demand, cheap power, to the point where Larry Fink, who is the leader of this disastrous net zero movement, has publicly said at the World Economic Forum that we need more natural gas and that solar and wind won't cut it. Even that guy is admitting this. So we need to wake up and live in reality, and it's a scary reality if we don't dramatically change our practices.
People should read the book Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt, and I forget the other guy's name, wrote Genesis, about the race for dominance in artificial intelligence. And the bottom line is that it is going to require enormous amounts of power. And while China is building some renewables, they're really focused on hydrocarbon, coal-based power generation. They're building it at an unprecedented pace. And they're also advancing in small modular nuclear, where we're not. And this is the existential threat to the United States. It's also a threat to our economy. Ms. Gunasekara, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And I would say one of the biggest issues with China's approach versus the U.S. is the coal plants that they're building aren't using pollution control equipment that our coal facilities have been using for decades. So while we stand by and sign pieces of paper with them, pretending like they're going to do something to lower their emissions, they continue on this trajectory, build these plants that actually ship particulate matter and things along those lines over to places like California that continue to struggle with meeting air quality standards from the early 2000s as a result.
Yeah, I worked for 2 international engineering companies. I worked for Combustion Engineering and their environmental systems, and we were leading in making major advances in air pollution control for coal-fired, for natural gas. But China is not the least bit confused about what the objective is. And it's I think ensuring that we maximize our access to high energy density, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about hydrocarbon and nuclear. Resources for power generation is not just an economic issue. It's a national security issue. And would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at national security, what does national security depend on? It depends above all on having an extremely robust economy that can produce weapons when necessary, that can keep people alive when necessary. That's number one. Number two is it relies on mobility. World War I and World War II were non-coincidentally won by the side with the most oil. And perhaps number three is going to be intelligence or augmented intelligence. So all of these things totally depend on unleashing energy. And I believe in all forms of energy being free to compete. But the idea that we're going to restrict fossil fuels and subsidize things that can't compete on their own, and that's going to be anything but a disaster, has been proven false.
The world is waking up to this.
Yeah, and everyone here needs to wake up to this today. Like, the arguments I'm hearing, like, I heard these in, 2013 when people were claiming Germany was going to be a success story.
Yeah.
I was right back then, but it's obvious now.
Well, I had a conversation with Eric Schmidt about his book, and he's gone the same direction that Mr. Fink went. He now says full-blown, full speed ahead on hydrocarbon and nuclear. The bottom line is that our nation's economic and national security are inseparably linked and dependent on reliable, affordable, and sufficient power to meet our needs and to compete with China. I yield back.
I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Gunasekara, welcome back to the committee. You're the author of the book, You All Are Fired, correct?
Y'all fired.
You all fired. I won't get the pronunciation perfect. And when you testified before our committee last September, you said, if I remember, you supported Project 2025's calls to fire thousands of federal workers, correct?
Yes.
And it looks like your wishes are coming true, correct?
Yeah, certainly some of the policies that I've suggested in the past seem to be being implemented in this administration.
Do you support the firing of the 2,400 Veteran Affairs employees, many of whom were doctors, nurses, and veterans themselves, that have taken place?
Again, I think that if people are in roles that don't substantially contribute to fulfilling the mission of the stated agency, that from a taxpayer resource perspective, those jobs should not continue to exist.
I understand your general view, but in terms of the specifics, I'm sure you follow them. Do you support the firings that have taken place at the Veterans Affairs Department?
I think the view that many of the firings that have taken place are from what I just described, that it's looking at roles and are they meaningfully contributing to fulfilling the agency's relative mission? And if they aren't, then
So
then
you
those people are
support
falling
them?
away.
Or I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, I do. I support
Okay.
the structural changes of this administration. I think it's long overdue. It's actually a breath of fresh
Several
air.
of the veterans who have been fired said that they were doing incredibly meaningful work, helping veterans who are struggling with depression. One of them yesterday talked about how he was in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just want to make sure I understand your position. So there are 2,400 veterans who have been fired. You support that. What do you think of firing the Agriculture Department workers who are trying to combat the bird flu crisis? Do you support that, or do you think that was a mistake?
Again, I think all of these structural changes are long overdue. There are many roles throughout the federal government that are duplicative and don't meaningfully advance related missions.
I appreciate
And so
the general
I think-
points, and I even recommend people read your book because I think it's being implemented. But do you support the specifics of the firings of people who were involved with the bird flu or not?
Yeah, I trust the people who are making these decisions.
So you support
looking
that.
at structural
How about the
reforms.
350 workers who, at the Department of Energy, were safeguarded with, were tasked with safeguarding our nuclear weapons? Do you support those firings, or do you think those were unnecessary, or do you believe those were redundant workers?
I think in many of those instances, those are redundant roles, and there's still people that remain fulfilling those key initiatives in every single agency, whether it's protecting veterans, whether it's ensuring the safe storage
I
of nuclear.
appreciate your two things about you. One, your straightforwardness about what you testified. Two, your willingness to testify before Congress. I've said that, Elon Musk and DOGE should come and be as straightforward, because you're basically telling the American public that you support the firing of the 2,400 people at the Veterans Department. You support the firing of the 350 employees who are there to protect bird flu. You see many of them as redundant. You support the firing of the people there to protect our nuclear safety, because you see them as redundant, and at least you're being transparent. Now, do you know if the employees who have been fired so far, the federal employees, do you have an estimate of how many of them are veterans? I'm not trying to trick you. I can give you the number.
I don't know the number offhand.
30% of the federal employees who have been fired are veterans. Do you think we should give special consideration not to be firing veterans, or do you think if someone's a veteran, it shouldn't matter?
I think that for anyone in the federal government that has lost their job, that there are lots of opportunities in the private sector.
But do you think there should be special protection or special consideration not to fire veterans, people who've gone to Iraq, Afghanistan, worn our uniform? Or do you think they should be treated like anyone else?
I think that anyone working in the federal government should be treated equally. Again,
Well, we just disagree. My view is that if someone has been a veteran who've served our uniform. I think that just like we have certain programs to help them get jobs, I think we should take extra care to make sure that we're not firing them. Have you heard of the Valentine's Day massacre?
I have, but please remind me.
That is what, well, that's what the federal employees, including the veterans, are calling it. Many of them got a note on Valentine's Day that they were going to be fired on Valentine's Day without any prior communication. If that happened, do you agree that that's the wrong way, just from a human level, of firing people, just giving them a note on Valentine's Day without any conversation?
I think there's a lot of people on Valentine's Day that struggle to make ends meet because this administration and the last administration overly focused on hiring and expanding the
So
federal
you're fine
government.
with people getting a note on Valentine's Day, all of them telling them that they're fired?
I think when it makes sense for them to get some notice, I mean, I think there's all sorts of ways to develop sob stories for people who have been on the receiving end of an overgrown, overbloated federal government, but you don't think about all of the rest of the people in the country that have been struggling to make ends meet because when you overemphasize the growth of the federal government, you deterred the development and opportunities
Well, I would
in the
just
private sector.
encourage you to listen to some of these stories because they were doing incredibly important work. They were high performers. They were fired without any notice, and I'm asking for consideration for President Trump to reinstate them, especially our veterans. Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I'd like to seek unanimous consent to enter two things into the record. One is a Yale article and study that says how China became the world's leader on renewable energy. The other one is a New York Times article entitled Why Trump's Clean Energy Rollbacks Could Derail a Factory Boom.
Both articles be submitted without objection. I now recognize the lady from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Gunasekara, I just want to commend you so much. Thank you for giving such straightforward answers. I was not hearing of the outcries from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle when our Keystone XL pipeliners were laid off, when my district was regulated into poverty, when oil and gas was pushed out by overregulation and Green New Deal policies. I did not hear the outcry for veterans or service members who were discharged from the military because they refused to take a trial vaccine that was not that we didn't know the effects of. I didn't hear the outcry for small businesses that went under and were not able to reopen. Many people lost their jobs over poor regulations and over-regulation. So thank you so much for giving clear and concise answers. We do have an overgrown and bloated government, and DOGE is absolutely exposing that and all of the waste, fraud, or theft and abuse that is taking place with our American tax dollars. So sorry, I don't have a question for you, but I wanted to just say thank you so much for being here and for your expertise. Mr. Epstein, we've heard a lot today about bird flu, that obviously that was under Joe Biden and his decision. We've heard about the Green New Deal. We heard that America needs to lead on green new energy, really this Green New scam. And we kind of can't when we're dependent on China and we're getting, our solar panels from them and they're using coal-fired energy to create their own energy, and we are kind of left suffering. Mr. Epstein, are there any myths that you've heard today in this hearing room that you would like to address, such as, frankly, some of the BS that I've heard from colleagues here and even one of our witnesses?
So yeah, let me just take, what I think is the overall myth is this idea that we need to impose dramatic restrictions on fossil fuels and give dramatic subsidies to unreliable solar and wind, as well as other uncompetitive forms of energy, in order to prevent a climate crisis / compete with China. That's sort of the overall thing. So just to break it down quickly, I don't know why we haven't learned from every other industry that's ever existed, but the way you get the best, cheapest, most reliable product is you leave people free to compete. You don't restrict the things that work and subsidize the things that don't, but we're magically pretending in energy that somehow works. I mean, imagine you outlawed iPhone and Android and just let random people with unreliable phones produce phones and you subsidize them. It makes no sense. The laws of economics apply here just as well as anywhere else. In terms of averting an alleged climate crisis, I've documented human beings are so resilient from climate that we we are safer than ever from climate. Our resilience is rooted in fossil fuels. So if we restrict fossil fuels, we make ourselves less resilient. We will reverse what's been an incredible decline in climate-related disaster deaths. So one is there is no climate crisis to avert. But then number two is by screwing up American energy, you do nothing to reduce global emissions because the emissions just get offshore to China and to more competitive economies, which brings me to China. And do we need to compete with them in renewables? And Ranking Member Frost mentioned a certain quote unquote study from Yale about this. And the issue is China is becoming the leader in fossil fuels. And one of their leading uses of fossil fuels is to produce overpriced, unreliable energy infrastructure that they sell to us and that we are incredibly dependent upon. So the whole thing is wrong, and what we need is very simple. We just need energy freedom. So we need the freedom for all forms of energy to compete. I think somebody mentioned we need technology-neutral standards for our grid. That's very important. We don't want to favor or disfavor any form of energy. But if we do that, given current economic realities, that's going to mean a lot of fossil fuels here and around the world. And overall, that's really good for people because a world with a lot of energy can handle any climate, but a world without much energy can't handle any climate or really anything else. Thank you.
Mr. Epstein, I want to give you the last 30 seconds or so to talk about the EPA, as you mentioned in your testimony, just things that they need to rescind and do better with in this new administration. We have Administrator Lee Zeldin now at the EPA, and I think he'll do a fantastic job. And hopefully he's read your books, The Moral Case of Fossil Fuel, Fossil Future. Hopefully he has your Alex AI app. I think that's a great tool for energy information, and it's actually reliable, kind of like the fossil fuel energy that we are discussing today. So if you want to use these last seconds, I used most of them.
Yeah, well, it's unfortunately it's in my testimony. The quick things I would just say are you need to be objective about the benefits of any of these restrictions, which are generally overblown, and you need to be very realistic about the costs, which are usually underestimated. And yeah, check out alexepstein.ai, free to use for everyone, and you could just use it dynamically and learn a lot about this testimony topic. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Ansari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. I'm proud to represent Arizona's 3rd Congressional District, a community of families who have been hit very hard by the cost of rising energy. At a time of rapidly increasing energy demand, it's absolutely imperative that we bring down costs and deliver economic security for Americans. However, I want to be clear, the cost of living crisis isn't happening because of some imaginary war on oil and gas. The United States is already producing more oil and gas than ever, more than any country in history. Instead of doubling down on fossil fuels, we need to prioritize a transition to clean, affordable, American-made energy. Unlike fossil fuels, which we have seen in recent years are subject to volatile global markets and price swings, clean energy provides long-term stability and allows working families to adequately budget for energy costs. There's been a lot of talk from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the need to protect and advance national security. The gravest existential threat to our national security is climate change. It's laughable, frankly, to hear you say that the climate crisis doesn't exist. I like to agree with the 99%.
Ask me a question and I'll explain.
No, I don't need to hear more explanation on lies. So it's actually the U.S. military establishment in the 1970s that first sounded the alarm on climate change and said that climate change is a threat multiplier to our national security. We've also heard from you about that we should not favor any type of energy, and I do agree with that, but I'm wondering why our current president has suspended new federal offshore wind, saying we're not going to do the wind thing, quote, big ugly windmills, they ruin your neighborhood. So it's just the concept of saying that we should not be going after any one form of energy while our president is doing the exact opposite.
I'm not the
as a favor
president. I
to-
don't agree with that policy.
So I'm talking about the actions of this administration. So
Well, that specific one I think was incorrect,
I didn't
but
ask
most
you
of
a
them are
question,
good.
sir. I'm sorry. I didn't ask
Okay,
you a
I thought you were
question.
addressing me.
So on the Phoenix City Council, I was proud to pass the city's ambitious climate action plan, unanimously start one of the most ambitious fleet transition plans in the country, all with Republican support. These initiatives were made possible by legislation such as the Inflation Reduction Act, which delivered historic levels of investment in clean energy. Arizona has gained over 18,000 clean energy jobs and nearly $12 billion in private investment related to the IRA. So with that, I'd like to turn to my questions to Dr. Cleetus. Thank you again for being here. Dr. Cleetus, are we seeing other states benefit from investment in clean energy? And what are things that states can do to increase their potential for economic growth?
We're seeing the benefits of clean energy all across the country. We've got more than 3 million clean energy jobs already, and the Inflation Reduction Act alone has created hundreds of thousands of jobs. We've seen these benefits, especially in the Southeast, but in every state, Nevada, Kentucky, Georgia, Florida. We've seen an incredible growth in manufacturing and jobs in this country. Now, the opportunity we have is to accelerate that transition, give people even more access to clean energy. We should not be prioritizing the interests of fossil fuel companies and their profits over the interests of the American consumers and the American people. So doubling down on fossil fuels, that only serves the fossil fuel industry. So of course they're spreading disinformation and misinformation about the climate science. They've been obstructing action on climate change for decades now. But their own scientists were the ones decades ago who said very clearly that burning fossil fuels will drive worsening climate change. And we are living in that reality right now.
Thank you so much. I could not agree more. Can you tell us a little bit more? What would divestment or taking certain energy options off of the table mean for states like Arizona, where 61% of energy jobs are clean energy jobs?
In states like Arizona, it's a twofold benefit because not only is it helping deliver clean, renewable energy, it is also helping address some of the challenges we face from extreme weather events like heat waves. Arizona has suffered from incredible, intense heat waves that have the clear fingerprints of climate change on them. And in those conditions, solar plus storage is really delivering around the country. Also in Texas, many states have seen this. When you have these extreme pressures on the grid, what can you bring online quickly and deliver reliably is not natural gas. It is solar plus storage again and again, and the data show it.
And finally, my colleagues across the aisle frequently claim that clean or renewable energy is less reliable than energy powered by fossil fuels, despite numerous studies showing that fossil fuel-fired plants are becoming increasingly unreliable. Dr. Cleetus, can you comment on the reliability of clean energy versus fossil fuels?
The clean energy, flexible, modern system that we're talking about right now is one where you couple renewables with storage, you build transmission so that you have a distributed grid, you have the opportunity for both microgrids, local generation, as well as long-distance transmission, which we should be building more of. This is the flexible system of the future, instead of getting stuck in this antiquated notion of baseload. Meanwhile, we have coal-fired power plants that are retiring because of market factors. Why do we want to put a thumb on the scale and leave consumers saddled with billions of dollars to keep these outdated, polluting plants online? And let's be very clear, who's paying the costs? We are, in health costs. Those costs are not costs that companies are taking into account. They're being socialized to all of us. The asthma, the heart ailments, the lung ailments, the deaths from cancer. That's the consequence of burning fossil fuels.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. It's been clear through the course of modern history that economic prosperity is directly related to the availability of affordable, abundant, transportable energy product. And across the world, where economic prosperity moves forward, built upon a cornerstone of affordable, reliable, transportable, abundant energy product, then the environment is cleansed in an economically enriched community. The air gets cleaner, the water gets cleaner, the land gets cleaner. So if our goal is to have a cleaner, more stable environment for our planet, then we should embrace the supply of energy product that most clearly reflects those key principles of as clean as possible, but abundant and affordable and transportable. So if energy product comes out of the gate as unaffordable and not abundant and unreliable, then it doesn't meet the criteria. So this is where my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have contention. None of us disagree with our responsibility to preserve our planet. We have a mandate since the dawn of man to nurture and care for our planet and the creatures thereof. And we take this responsibility very seriously. But I would ask the young lady, Ms. Gunasekara, regarding the mission statement of the EPA. You're a former employee of the EPA, correct?
Yes.
And how would you describe in a sentence, what's the mission statement of the EPA?
To protect public health and the environment.
Thank you very much. So to protect the public health and the environment worldwide is an aspiration, but the mission statement of the Environmental Protection Agency is to protect the environment of the United States, correct? And we accept the role as the world's energy leader, both in consumption and production and in technology that is shared with the entire world. So regarding permitting, Mr. Herrgott, what would happen if permitting at the federal level was streamlined to allow for a more aggressive introduction of clean, affordable, reliable, transportable energy product in the United States and worldwide? What would happen in those communities?
So I just to make a point, and I know my friends in the press know that I live in the numbers. More wind and solar was built under the Trump administration than the entire Biden administration the last 3 years of the Obama administration. We have to look at the facts, all right? The facts are not hyperbole. More than 50% of Oklahoma, my home state, I'm from Arizona originally, but I worked for Senator Inhofe, who Mandy and I both worked, who we missed greatly, was always a fan of let's make the level playing field for everyone. Remove the obstacles.
Respectfully, I've been to Oklahoma. I've toured that grid. I'm familiar with it, and I'm asking you, what would happen if Congress streamlines the permit and the executive branch streamlines the permitting process for investors that are standing by to invest in
We would see a
clean-
20 to 30% reduction in project cost, an immediate reduction in the futures market to reduce electricity prices.
Thank you.
And we've
So
seen
we're talking
expansion.
about hundreds of billions of dollars. Am I correct?
Yes.
And we all concur that economic prosperity is the cornerstone of a clean environment. So if this is our goal, then worldwide, then we should support the American energy industry. Mr. Epstein, you referenced nuclear, and I'm going to leave with this question here as my time is expiring, and I hope you answer it. You referenced nuclear in the 70s and how it was not allowed to emerge fully. That government restrictions sort of stopped the full emergence of nuclear power. And I think you made an interesting point there. You stated that we are artificially restricting supply while we're artificially increasing demand. So if Congress were to allow the full manifestation of the American energy industry, what would happen to the supply of that energy product and therefore the expense of that energy product?
I mean, if you truly unleash it, and again, I give a few dozen things in my written testimony, and if people go to energytalkingpoints.com, we have like 110 new proposals, 112. It would just be the greatest increase in prosperity. I mean, you might actually have a shot of, for new electricity, reducing the price by 50%, but it really requires dramatic things. With nuclear in particular, that's really important. I should say, by the way, the #1 organization probably that ruined nuclear was the Union of Concerned Scientists, which we have a witness from today, that they deserve a special
I thank the
place
gentleman, and
in
my
blame.
time has long expired, so out of respect for my colleagues, I'm going to close my questioning, and I move to the gentleman, Mr. Min, Representative Min from California. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I see that we are on the Oversight Committee. We're exploring oversight. That seems to be a topic we're largely ignoring, but I will get back to that in a moment. A lot of discussion around energy policy and climate change. And so I guess my question is, for each of you, do you have a degree in science? Let's start with you, Mr. Epstein. PhD, master's?
No, believe it or not, you
Yes
can be
or
a
no-
self-taught
yes or no
expert.
question. Yes or no question, sir.
It's
and
not quite a valid
Ms.
question.
Carr, do you have a degree in science?
No.
Mr. Herrgott, are you a degree in science? Undergrad, MBA, or master's?
No, but I am a nerd.
Okay, how about yourself, doctor? I guess you are a scientist. What was your degree in?
Economics,
Okay.
social science.
That's not a
You're
science.
not a climate scientist, then?
Not a climate scientist,
Okay.
a social scientist.
Okay,
yes.
interesting. So I am not a scientist either. I'm a lawyer. I am self-taught as well. But I work with a lot of scientists at UC Irvine. I've talked to a lot of scientists around climate, around oceans, and our atmosphere. And I think there is clearly a consensus that the burning of fossil fuels by emitting carbon into our atmosphere is causing dramatic changes in our environment. The science on this is fairly undisputed at this point, other than a handful of people on the extremes. I think every credible scientist agrees with this. We're seeing the effects of this right now. Extreme weather events, 140-degree temperatures in India last year, highest ever in recorded history. And the thing is, I think if we listen to the scientists, I know scientists are a little out of style today, that in 100 years we're going to look back and say that the weather today, the temperatures were uniquely cool, and the weather patterns were uniquely benign. And so I will just make an observation that I think we have a moral imperative to think about the future that we are creating for our children, grandchildren, and beyond. I will also say that, I know there's a lot of talk about economics here, but that we should be thinking about the external costs, negative externalities of burning fossil fuels. That's something that we know is not factored into the cost of oil. When we pay for gas at the gas pump, we're not paying for the costs that these impose over time on our society. And I think these costs are conservatively estimated in the tens of trillions of dollars to our society. But I want to take this back to the question of oversight, because last May, Donald Trump famously held a meeting with oil executives that was organized by the person that then became the Secretary of Interior, where he publicly stated that he would slash regulations on the oil industry if they donated $1 billion to his campaign. At the time, my kids were asking me, isn't this a bribe? It looks like a bribe when somebody running for office promises to do something in exchange for a contribution. I said, it does look like a bribe. I don't know how to describe this. The oil industry, of course, responded with hundreds of millions of dollars in donations, both directly to Trump's campaign, as well as through different super PACs and other vehicles that were created by Citizens United. And now, of course, we have congressional Republicans pushing forward an agenda to try to deregulate oil. Now, I've had thousands of constituents call my office to say, we need to stop this. This is bribery. This is the House Republicans pushing pay-to-play policies. I question to you, and I guess I'll direct this to Dr. I'm sorry, Mr. Name. It is Dr.
Cleetus.
Cleetus. How am I supposed to respond to my kids? How am I supposed to respond to my constituents who say that this is institutionalized bribery, that there is no oversight happening right now of this carrying out of pay-to-play policies?
You know, it's really disturbing to see the administration's appointees, many of whom are directly connected to the fossil fuel industry or are climate science deniers. As you said, the science is nonpartisan. It is universally accepted that human-caused climate change is being driven by burning fossil fuels. As an economist, I can tell you it's already having a significant impact on the U.S. economy. You just need to look at the insurance crisis, the pending crisis to real estate that's exposed to extreme weather and climate-related events, the labor productivity impacts of extreme heat waves. The economic fingerprints of climate change are also clear. So in this context,
just reclaiming my time, sorry to interrupt, Doctor, I would just point out that there are lots of jobs being created around the world right now. And is it the case that China and Germany and other countries are investing heavily in clean energy right now?
They are.
And do you see that as the future of, say, jobs and innovation?
It absolutely is.
Yeah, so we are moving away from that, and this happens to follow a promise made by then-candidate Trump to slash regulations on oil in exchange for $1 billion. And I just want to make that point because a lot of folks out there are questioning why we're doing this in the aftermath of Donald Trump making that promise. And there's no oversight of that promise. There was none last year. There's none right now of what looks very blatantly like it is a criminal activity of promising something in return for campaign contribution, which we all know is illegal. If I did that, I would rightly be charged. But there was no oversight. There continues to be no oversight over that particular exchange. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry, is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm not a scientist either, and I don't even talk to a lot of scientists, but I took science, and so for Mr. Epstein, is science consensus? 'Cause I never was taught that, so I'm just looking for what is science consensus?
I actually think consensus has a value in science. Ultimately, it's about who can prove the truth. But I know my representative, Dave Min, is leaving right now, but maybe he'll listen to this later. I live in Laguna Beach. I'm one of his constituents, too. So what you really need is you need science combined with other fields. So to determine if we have a climate crisis, you need to know climate science, adaptation, economics, et cetera. And if you look at the macro data, we are safer than ever from climate disasters. And the #1 climate-related killer is cold. So we are not in a warming crisis, even though we are, I believe, changing climate. Climate change does not equal climate catastrophe, and that is ultimately an issue of philosophy and methodology, not an issue of science.
So, and is there proof? They always talk about the proof. There's proof that the use of traditional fuels is costing, and they come up, he said, trillions of dollars as a conservative estimate. Is there any empirical data to support that claim whatsoever?
He said, yeah, I'm going to ask my representative for a meeting soon to tell him some stuff on, share some facts about this. He said, conservatively, it's tens of trillions, I think, a year. Okay, so the global economy is 100 trillion, so we're just losing like a third of our wealth. Now, so what's actually happening is cheap energy is driving incredible well-being, increases in life expectancy, resiliency, et cetera, et cetera. And to the externalities point, the positive externalities far, far outweigh the negative externalities, which is why every metric of human life is getting better. People who focus on negative externalities are what I call fossil fuel benefit deniers. Happy to give Dr. Cleetus, Representative Min, anyone else a copy of my book, Fossil Future. Chapter 4 in particular explains the pseudoscience of only looking at negative externalities. So the positive externalities are amazing. The overall impacts are amazingly positive and will continue to be so.
So this might get a little wonky, but if you could make it simple
Sure.
for people like me and everybody else that's not a scientist, we're living in, I think, the second lowest atmospheric carbon content in Earth's history, not in man's history, but in Earth's history. I think we're in the second lowest point of atmospheric carbon in the Earth's history. Can you discuss what the effects, first of all, is carbon pollution, or is it like plant food? Is carbon pollution, and how do the effects, I'm from Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania we talk about a thing called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Can you discuss the effects of how that initiative would, what those effects would be on the energy market, on prices and availability of energy?
Sure. So when you're talking about a low point of carbon, it's all depending on your time scale, because if you took it year by year, we're at a high point in CO2 in the atmosphere for the last 150 years. But if you look at it in a scale like 100 million years, it's a different kind of thing. So in general, compared to the Earth's history, we are at a low point, and we've had mammals and our descendants and stuff like that exist at much higher levels of CO2 and thrive. My argument is we can thrive at almost any conceivable level of CO2 that has existed. We can thrive at a wide variety of temperatures. The only concern is just, is the rate of change so much that you're just changing the infrastructure too quickly? Unfortunately, with sea levels, which would be the biggest concern, they're currently rising at 1 foot a century, and extreme projections are 3 feet a century. So we just don't have any catastrophically disruptive rate of change. So this idea that change equals catastrophe is an anti-human idea that denies our ability to adapt and master our surroundings, and also just treats anything we cause as bad because we caused it. Now, in terms of how this manifests in RGGI and other policies, basically, RGGI is a dressed-up carbon tax, right? It means you're forcing people to pay more money for electricity in particular that involves CO2. So what you do is you take the cheapest form of electricity, which is not being outcompeted, and you make it more expensive. That means energy is more expensive. That means everything is more expensive. That means your region is less able to compete. And if I may, I want to make one comment about the jobs, because that's the only thing I haven't refuted yet. It's a total trash argument that this is creating all these miraculous jobs. It is not creating any net new jobs. It is creating welfare work. It is creating jobs that are uneconomic, uncompetitive. To follow Milton Friedman, why don't we just pay a bunch of people to scoop dirt with spoons out of the ground? That'll create jobs too. What we want is productive jobs, and the way we get productive jobs is we liberate the economy so that we get the most productive jobs possible. So this doesn't create any new good jobs. It's creating a bunch of welfare work, and Congress should send a signal to all the subsidy seekers that, hey, it is not safe to create fake businesses based on subsidies. We want real businesses. So if we take the subsidies away, that is a great lesson to the American economy to not be subsidy seekers and to be real value creators.
I yield the balance.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Frost for his closing remarks.
Thank you so much. Thank you thank you to everyone for being here today. Look, I think we've heard a lot of interesting opinions throughout this hearing. But what we know to be true is that we are facing a devastating climate crisis. It is not hypothetical. It's also not something I've read about, but it is something I've experienced being in the state of Florida. And I think the topic of this hearing is important: energy reliability and resilience. But I got to say that having a Project 2025 author and then having a guy that I would say is pretty much a conspiracy theorist calling climate change a hoax and false.
I didn't say that.
Science. I didn't ask you a question.
But you did tell a lie
Don't
about
talk.
me.
I didn't ask you a question. Calling climate change pseudoscience, despite the scientific consensus being that the climate crisis is real and we are impacting it, I think is not helpful for the topic of this hearing. And so, I hope as we move forward, we can have. I definitely learned a lot from our other two witnesses. I do think that there's room for bipartisanship on resiliency, but unfortunately, I think a lot of this hearing was spent listening to baseless opinions that are not based on scientific fact or from any real experts on that. And I do think that it's important that as we look at the actions of this administration, we hold in line, number one, the promise that the president made to American families across the country that our costs would come down. We don't think that's going to happen. And number two, the fact that we've already begun marching towards this new green economy that's going to create tons of good paying jobs, that's going to help us protect our planet, that's going to help spur business across the country, especially a lot of small businesses in my district in Orlando. And completely reversing that is a waste of taxpayer money. I agree that there's ways that we can do this in a better way, but completely abandoning this for political purposes, I think, is the wrong thing to do. And to put the cherry on the top, the reason is to completely continue to put more money into big polluters. And as we know, their profits are at an all-time high, and our costs are high. And so, my hope is as we continue here, we can really dig into bipartisan solutions and stay away from conspiracy theories and climate denying. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for closing remarks. I just want to say thank you very much for our expert witnesses for coming today. I believe that we had a robust debate on policy, and I'm glad that we stuck to the debate. This hearing has been
This hearing of the Subcommittee on Delivering on Government Efficiency will come to order. Welcome, everyone. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Good morning. I want to welcome everyone today to today's DOGE Subcommittee hearing on U.S. foreign aid. This hearing comes at an important time, a time where all of us are witnessing billions of dollars in taxpayer waste, fraud, and abuse being exposed across every agency of our federal government. It comes at a time where oversight of U.S. foreign aid has uncovered billions of dollars that have been weaponized in furtherance of globalist far-left ideologies. The American people want change. The American people voted for change. The American people have spoken that they no longer wish to be enslaved by the bureaucracy's agenda of undermining U.S. interest abroad. In 2023 alone, Americans privately donated over $557 billion of their own money. Corporations donated over $37 billion. Foundations donated over $103 billion. That is incredible of the American people. In 2023, nearly 76 million Americans, almost 30% of Americans, formally volunteered through an organization. Volunteered. The government did not make them do that. They did this on their own. Donating and volunteering time is what supports schools and shelters, hospitals and hotlines, food banks, and more across only our country. Not only our country, but across the world. Ask anyone in Western North Carolina. Whether it be individuals, churches, or businesses, the American people are the most generous people in the entire world. And I'm so proud of that. They should be the ones who decide where their money goes. They can choose if they want to donate to a charity, a school, a church, or a nonprofit. They can choose if they want to privately donate to a transgender salon in Mumbai. They can choose if they want to privately donate to the British Broadcasting Corporation. They can choose if they want to privately donate to the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth Alliance, or to electric vehicles in Vietnam, or to changing the national census in Bangladesh to be more gender inclusive. That is something they should be able to choose. That is something they should never be forced to do by our government. The Democrat-run USAID should not get to use our federal government, our U.S. taxpayer dollars, as their party piggy bank to push their radical agenda in countries that we have no business giving money to. 96% of all political contributions from USAID employees go to Democrat Party candidates or PACs. That's 96%. Not only is USAID giving $70,000 for a DEI musical in Ireland, or $50,000 for transgender opera in Colombia, or to entrench their left-wing ideology across the globe, USAID has been transformed into an America Last foreign aid slush fund to prop up extremist groups, implement censorship campaigns, and interfere in foreign elections to force regime change around the world. That is the dark truth about USAID. That is the story the American people deserve to know. Not only was USAID never designed to be what it has morphed into, but these things should never have been funded in the first place. In fiscal year 2023, USAID dispersed roughly $44 billion of aid across 160 countries and regions around the world. During the 4 years of the Biden administration, 181 countries received approximately $240 billion in U.S. development aid, with Ukraine being the top recipient. Other top recipients include Ethiopia, Jordan, Israel, and Somalia. So after hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars have been distributed throughout the world, has the world become safer? No. Has the world become more stable? No. Is the perception of the United States around the globe any better? No. But have some of the most anti-democratic principles like censorship and the canceling of elections been funded through USAID because of opposition to the ruling regimes? Yes. Has money through USAID been funneled to terrorists? Yes. Foreign aid from USAID to the UN, particularly the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, is directly funding Hamas terrorists. Humanitarian relief intended for the Afghan people was diverted to the Taliban. Money intended to support democracy is being used as a slush fund for liberal propaganda supporting terrorist, gender ideology, diversity, equity, and inclusion, climate activism, censorship, and regime change. Do you think this is what the American people think of when they think of foreign aid? Absolutely not. Taxpayer funds have literally been used to undermine U.S. interest and counter American foreign policy goals under the guise of foreign aid. This is unacceptable, and the American people agree. Thankfully, President Trump has taken action to address these issues. The election of President Trump was a clear mandate by the American people that they will no longer tolerate this. He is putting an end to the foreign aid slush fund, ensuring the hard-working American taxpayers' dollars are supporting America First policies and taking care of our own people at home. And we will do the same. With that, I now recognize Ranking Member Stansbury for the purpose of making an opening statement.
All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Elon Musk Chainsaw Massacre, except for this remake of a classic is terrible because it's hurting real people, and its lead character, Mr. Musk, hasn't shown up in front of this committee or Congress at all. We also, of course, call this the Subcommittee on DOGE, or Project 2025, as we'll see here during the Q&A. So today, in this hearing on foreign aid, which the GOP has called, you're going to hear all kinds of wild conspiracy theories, accusations, and unfounded data. It's designed to confuse and provide cover for Donald Trump and Elon Musk in their reckless gutting of our foreign aid and our reordering under the Trump administration of international affairs. But before we dive into the details, I want to zoom out and provide some critical context here about why this is happening. So first of all, let's talk about what happened over the last 2 weeks as the administration took an abrupt about-face in international relations after 64 years of USAID and supporting our allies in Europe, turning its back on long-standing allies and now suddenly embracing and enabling U.S. foreign adversaries. Let's do a little oversight here. Last week, the administration shocked the world as the vice president took to the global stage and addressed European leaders and informed them that the Trump administration believes that the greatest threat to Europe is not the autocratic leader who invaded our Western ally 3 years ago and committed war crimes and atrocities against the Ukrainian people and threatened Western democracy, but instead the VP said it was, quote, a threat from within. He then snubbed our German allies and, in an unprecedented move, tacitly endorsed and then met with a far-right candidate from the German parliament who Elon Musk has spent months backing. This is a party that is so extreme that even conservatives in Germany will not form a government with them. Then, over the weekend, Donald Trump went on a wild rant on social media, embracing Vladimir Putin and repeating Russian propaganda, trying to rewrite history and falsely claim that Ukraine started a war against its own people. Then, on Monday, Trump had the United States of America vote with Russia, North Korea, and China as 4 of the only 8 countries in the world voting in the UN against a resolution supporting Ukraine and affirming Ukraine's sovereignty. When you think about what this means in the context of American history, it's truly astonishing. That same day, which was only 2 days ago, the administration announced that they would proceed with firing another 2,000 USAID workers, even as a court ruled that the administration's dismantling of the aid organization is illegal. And interestingly, one of the main opponents of USAID programs is Donald Trump's buddy, Vladimir Putin. Why? Because among the programs that the U.S. was funding before the funding was frozen was aid to Ukraine, including safe houses on the front lines, a free and open press to help keep people informed what was happening in the war, not to mention refugee resettlement in the United States. USAID was also engaged in democracy building in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, especially with the fall of the USSR. Of course, Mr. Putin didn't like that either. And these investments have been totally decimated over the last several weeks. Over the last 5 years, USAID has funded international aid to 212 countries around the world to promote international peace and security, to help maintain stability, and ensure that we are making good on America's promises. These investments are a fraction of the cost of weapons and defense, and the U.S. in the process is able to help promote national security, stop global pandemics, prevent hunger and mass migrations, and make the world and the United States a safer place. So when we hear conservative allies of Donald Trump repeat wild and unfounded claims about international aid, and we see a coordinated attack by conservative media, think tanks like those who are here today, members of Congress, the administration, we have to ask ourselves, what is really going on here, folks? Why the hell are they so hell-bent on dismantling an organization that has been so vital to American interests and Western democracy for so long? Over the last several days, they have fired thousands of federal employees. It really does make you wonder, doesn't it? And by the way, while they've been doing that, China has actually moved in already to places in South Asia that had their funding cut and is beginning to replace American diplomacy and aid in those places. So as we listen to this hearing today and hear from our witnesses, which I look forward to, I hope that we can get to the bottom of what is actually going on here today. And with that, I look forward to hearing the testimony.
January 24th, Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave an order that came with a waiver for emergency food assistance, which was broadened even further several days later for life-saving services. Secretary Rubio has stated very clearly, we have a blanket waiver, and anybody who tells you they don't understand it, let me repeat it in very simple words. If it saves lives, if it's emergency life-saving aid, food, medicine, whatever, they have a waiver. I don't know how much clearer we can be. And if we're not applying it, then maybe we're not a very good organization and maybe they shouldn't be getting any money at all. Additionally, in-kind food assistance purchased from U.S. farmers is continuing. I'm pleased to introduce our witnesses today. Max Primorak is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. He has more than 30 years of international work experience, including as acting chief operating officer at USAID and as a USAID contractor. From 2018 to 2019, he was an administration envoy to Iraq, overseeing a $400 million genocide recovery initiative to facilitate returns of Christians and other persecuted religious minorities. Greg Roman is the executive director of Middle East Forum. He is a frequent commentator about Middle East affairs on both national and international news channels and studied national security and political communications at American University and Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. Tyler O'Neill is senior editor at The Daily Signal and author of The Woktopus, The Dark Money Cabal Manipulating the Federal Government. He is a writer and commentator on federal policy and has appeared on both local and national news outlets. Finally, Noam Unger is the Director of Sustainable Development and Resilience Initiative at the Center for Strategic International Studies and a senior fellow with the Project on Prosperity and Development. He has served at both USAID and the U.S. Department of State. Again, I want to thank all of you for being here to testify today. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witnesses will please stand and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may take a seat. We appreciate you being here today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witnesses that we will have read your written statement and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral statement to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes have expired, and we would ask that you please wrap up. I now recognize Max Primorak for his opening statement.
Madam Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to testify before this very important subcommittee. The views I express here today are my own. Over the past few weeks, indeed, we have been treated to a daily litany of examples of waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer-funded foreign aid. USAID and the State Department used foreign aid as a global platform to push radical and even obscene ideas that have shocked and angered the American people. One cannot help but ask, was there anyone in the room raising their hand to say, this is not a good idea? This might cost us our bipartisan support in Congress. We might lose the trust of the American people. Yes, foreign aid should be a tool to advance our national security interests. In the past, it did. Today, it does not. Frankly, it has been doing harm. While spending more on aid, there is more world poverty and hunger today, more political instability, and developing countries are more beholden to our adversaries. At USAID, I co-chaired an interagency working group that put all aid projects through a counter-China lens. That was dismantled. Instead, the Biden administration wasted billions of dollars on a global green agenda that forced poor countries to rely on China for their energy needs. These countries sought more trade with and investment from the United States to bind our countries closer together. Instead, they got transgender, diversity, and abortion programs that have alienated billions of people. Despite what we hear in the media, there is no linkage between how we do aid and our national security. South Africa has received billions of American aid dollars, yet is China's main Africa partner. South Africa is the S in BRICS. It supports Hamas and Iran and opposes us at every turn at the United Nations. Last summer, Mozambique and Tanzania, other large aid recipients, conducted 2-week military exercises with the People's Liberation Army, expanding Communist China's power projection to the lip of our Atlantic Ocean. 19 of the top 20 USAID recipients are members of China's Belt and Road Initiative. While acting Chief Operating Officer at USAID, I approved strong vetting policies for our humanitarian assistance in countries swarming with terrorists. That too was ignored by the Biden administration. Vast sums of U.S. money have been diverted to fund terrorists in Gaza, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. NGOs have been hit with heavy fines for violating our anti-terrorism financing laws. But closer scrutiny is warranted, for the problem is endemic in the aid culture. Last year, USAID launched its $45 million Global Civil Society program based on the social theories of an Italian Marxist. Literally, we have been funding radical NGOs around the world that oppose capitalism, democracy, NATO, and Christianity. None of this is counter-China. This is counter-America. Again, a resounding yes that foreign aid can be a powerful tool of diplomacy to promote freedom, prosperity, and peace in accordance with our national interest and our values, but not as an instrument of progressive imperialism. Regardless of which party controls the executive branch, aid officials must ensure that every single foreign aid program can pass the Middle America smell test on waste, fraud, and abuse. Aid decisions must always secure bipartisan support. There must be full transparency on who is being funded and what they're doing, not only for the members of Congress, but especially for the American people. The fiduciary failure of our aid officials over the past 4 years has done tremendous damage to foreign aid's credibility and America's standing in the world. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I now recognize Greg Roman for his opening statement.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Greg Roman, Director of the Middle East Forum, and I'm here because there's a fox loose in the henhouse of our foreign aid system, a system intended to uplift lives abroad that instead has funneled millions of taxpayer dollars to radical and terrorist-linked organizations. If we don't fix these fences now, we risk fueling violence against our allies, our troops, and potentially ourselves. Let me be clear. This is a problem that began under the Obama administration and was exacerbated under the Biden administration. It's a problem that has been brewing across both of these 12 years of governance by a bureaucracy so insulated it can't always tell teachers from terrorists. The result is moral confusion among grant officers who unwittingly, and in some cases, may intentionally bankroll extremist causes. At the Middle East Forum for the last 12 years, we've engaged in oversight over all public spending relating to foreign aid, specifically those relating to Middle East and Islamist causes. And we have identified over $122 million, which has ended up supporting radical organizations or even directly bankrolling organizations which are considered to be terrorists by the U.S. government. That's not pocket change, that's a jackpot for the wrong crowd. In terms of our specific findings, World Vision. Over the past 2 decades, this major evangelical NGO has received nearly $2 billion from USAID. But in 2014, World Vision facilitated a $125,000 grant to the Islamic Relief Agency, an entity linked to Al-Qaeda. Even after a whistleblower raised red flags, USAID rammed through the funding, pressured by World Vision, Sudanese warlords, and even U.S. officials who lobbied to delist the terror organization. Helping Hand Relief and Development. In 2023, only 2 years ago, it received a $78,000 grant from USAID, despite openly working with the terrorists who orchestrated the 2008 Mumbai massacre in India. Worse, the offer and grant came after the USAID Inspector General launched an investigation into a prior grant to the same group. The Jamal Trust Bank in Lebanon. USAID dollars helped pad the pockets of this financial institution, later designated by the U.S. Treasury Department as a terror sponsor for sponsoring Hezbollah. This was no mere oversight. It points to a broken system that handed cash to a future terror financing entity. Some graphical evidence. Behind me, you'll see the Bayadar and Unlimited Friends Association, 2 groups in Gaza. Members of the Gazan charity Bayadar cozy up to senior members of the Hamas Politburo, like Abdul Salam Haniyeh, the son of slaughtered Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, credited as one of the planners of the October 7th attacks on Israel, which killed Israelis and American citizens. Meanwhile, UFA officials have called for their lands to be cleansed from the so-called, quote, impurity of the Jews. You'll see behind me 4 images which don't just show members of Bayadar and UFA associating with members of Hamas, but also USAID officials, employees of the U.S. government, receiving awards because of their cooperation with these 2 Hamas-linked entities. You even have a Facebook post from a few years ago, which is the USAID office in Jerusalem celebrating their relationship with a Hamas entity. I can't find anything more disgusting. And as the ranking member said, we're looking for evidence. This is not a conspiracy. This is a U.S. government communication. Lastly, masking the money trail. Billions of dollars in USAID grants are lumped under miscellaneous foreign awardees, making it impossible for Congress, the media, or the public to track who's really getting the funds. According to public testimony in another hearing in this Congress, a portion of this money has ended up in the hands of al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria. How does this happen? The oversight conducted by USAID is as weak as a house of cards in a windstorm, like handing out cash in a dark alley and hoping it doesn't buy trouble. USAID's vetting system is archaic, relying heavily on self-reported data with no real-time checks or teeth. Primary grantees are entrusted to vet their own subcontractors, even when those grantees themselves might sympathize with radical causes. In places like Gaza or Sudan, groups with blatant extremist affiliations slip through because the so-called gatekeepers have no incentive or even an ideological desire to shut them out. This isn't a glitch. It's a feature of a broken system. And here's the kicker. It's a problem caused by bureaucrats now threatening American interests at home and abroad. It's not just about fraud, waste, and abuse. This is a threat to American national security and potentially criminal, and this committee should take action to ensure that the Department of Justice acts on it and does everything in Congress's power to not just investigate, but refer criminal actions to the proper authorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roman. I now recognize Tyler O'Neill for his opening statement.
Chairwoman Green, members of the subcommittee, the last few weeks have featured revelation after revelation of how our tax dollars have been spent propping up radical left-wing causes across the world. Yet what struck me about the abuse of foreign aid has been the connections with leftist activists here at home. As a senior editor at the Daily Signal, I researched the left's dark money network, which propped up the influence campaign I expose in my book, The Woktopus. I found that leftist elites prop up NGOs that staffed and advised the Biden administration, pushing unpopular policies on the American people through the bureaucracy. In my remarks, I will present 3 examples of how the left's dark money network intersects with just one agency focused on foreign aid, the U.S. Agency for International Development. The views I will express in this testimony are my own. The left's dark money network features George Soros and his Open Society Foundations, the Tides Foundation, and the network of nonprofits established by Arabella Advisors. These groups, which you can see on this chart, funnel cash to DEI, transgender, and climate alarmist causes, divisive issues that the Biden administration prioritized over addressing the concrete needs of the American people. The left's dark money network has deep ties to USAID, which has rightly received renewed scrutiny under DOGE and after Elon Musk shined a light on it. While the Open Society Foundations has stated that it does not receive funds from USAID or direct USAID's spending, the Soros-founded nonprofit has a long history with USAID. In 2001, the Soros Foundations Network, which became Open Society, listed USAID among its donor partners. Open Society and USAID have jointly funded the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, a news outlet that attacked conservatives for, you guessed it, criticizing Soros. Open Society and USAID also jointly fund the East-West Management Institute. Among other things, the institute launched court changes in Albania that critics allege resulted in the prosecution of Albanian opposition leader Sali Berisha, silencing the opponent of the country's socialist prime minister. Open Society has hired at least 5 former USAID staff, including at least one high-level official who worked at USAID providing services amid political transitions in foreign countries. Former USAID Administrator Samantha Power met at least twice with Open Society leaders. USAID has directly funded a different organization in the left's dark money network, the Tides Center. The agency has awarded more than $27 million in grants to the center. You'll find the Tides Foundation right here. The Tides Center has funded many of the leftist groups that influence the Biden administration, and it also operates its own in-house nonprofit called Palestine Legal, which represents anti-Israel rioters in court and gives them legal advice. Former USAID staff have also gone on to work for Arabella Advisors, which is a for-profit company that set up pass-through nonprofits. These groups allow donors to support specific projects without being associated with these projects. One of the nonprofits, New Venture Fund, set up a secretive group called Governing for Impact. Even though Governing for Impact had existed for barely 2 years and did not appear in a Google search at the time, its leaders met with and advised top staff in the Biden administration, executive-level bureaucrats who oversaw the vast federal bureaucracy. Leaders of the Rockefeller Foundation, another funder in the left's dark money network, previously held roles at USAID, including the former administrator, who now serves as the foundation's president. Other USAID staff have gone on to work at the nonprofits that staffed and advised the Biden administration, including the Center for American Progress, the Human Rights Campaign, and the American Civil Liberties Union. Personnel is policy, and these connections between the left's influence campaign on the Biden administration and USAID reveal how woke elites have captured the enterprise of foreign aid. Thank you.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. And I will inform this committee and the public watching that if, pardon? Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Unger. Apologize. I didn't mean to skip over you. I now recognize Mr. Unger for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, Ranking Member Stansbury, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am honored to share my views with you. They are my own and not those of my current or former employers. I have served at USAID and the State Department in multiple roles and in non-governmental positions focused on U.S. foreign aid reform and global development. My government service took place during the administrations of Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. Every U.S. administration since World War II has wanted to shape foreign aid in line with its goals. But strangling the system into extinction is akin to unilaterally disarming at a time of mounting geopolitical competition for partnerships globally. Throwing away our toolbox does not make us safer or well-positioned to influence the world. Our set of foreign aid tools reflects enlightened self-interest. With it, the U.S. countered communism and enhanced the education, farming productivity, and health of people around the world, while also saving lives. Our international AIDS and malaria programs have collectively saved more than 35 million lives over the past couple decades. U.S. assistance has also built partnerships and economic growth, so much so that 11 of America's 15 biggest trading partners were former recipients of U.S. foreign assistance. We are now in a period of renewed geostrategic competition. China has been vying with the U.S. for partnerships across the global south, inking deals where it can. China can and will fill soft power voids left by the U.S. Other potential threats to our security are also connected to developing countries and fragile states. From the potential resurgence of ISIS in the Middle East to the spreading influence of Islamist militants and Russian mercenaries across the Sahel. On the eastern edge of Europe, Russian aggression may continue to grow unchecked, and in Colombia, the strife from neighboring Venezuela is spilling over to yield the worst violence in a generation. With that backdrop, the administration has abruptly and collectively disabled U.S. tools of foreign assistance. The White House has said it is cutting programs that do not benefit Americans. But their approach is dismantling many programs that help Americans, thereby cutting off our nose to spite our face. This is evident in many ways. First, the government has purchased more than $2 billion in food aid annually from American farmers, and American farms supply more than 40% of the food aid USAID sends around the world. But with the foreign aid freeze and stop work order, rice, wheat, and soybeans are going to waste in transit and in ports. In Houston alone, hundreds of tons of American-grown wheat have been stranded. The recklessness of the current approach is evident in health efforts, too. We need our foreign aid to prevent outbreaks of infectious diseases from spreading before reaching our shores. But U.S.-funded early detection and treatment for deadly diseases like Ebola have sputtered to a standstill. Even where very few waivers have been issued for some life-saving assistance, reports from implementers indicate that few, if any, programs have actually resumed due to payment systems not functioning and USAID staff layoffs. It is also counterproductive to eviscerate programs focused on other transnational concerns, ranging from conflict and corruption to migration and the trafficking of people and drugs. This unserious review process is additionally causing our government to be tied up in court cases that may drag on for years and prove costly in connection to broken contracts and potential violations of law. These losses are unnecessary, even if, or perhaps especially if, you believe, like I do, in the need for reforms. It is critically important to be able to differentiate between waste and congressionally appropriated projects that may reflect different policy priorities. Waste is the food rotting in ports. It's the purchased medicines that cannot be distributed. It is the cutting of programs and firing of people that then, in turn, prevents this administration from being able to meet its own foreign policy goals. Going forward, Government will need an oversight approach to programming that includes the following. 1, a congressional notification and review process so committees can pause or halt projects. 2, implementing partners should undergo audits and submit detailed plans and quarterly expenditure reports. 3, in highly insecure contexts, there should be a vetting of key program staff against classified counterterror databases before U.S. dollars are spent. And 4, an inspector general should be empowered to conduct investigations and other activities to help identify, prevent, and punish any proven misuse of taxpayer funding. The issue before you today is that these elements are precisely the safeguards that have already been in place at USAID. But the staffing to carry it out has just been gutted. By destroying this system of oversight, the administration has done more damage to effective programming than any specific project failures critics of foreign aid may choose to highlight. We should all care about foreign aid. We should care enough to make it better, not kill it. Congress has a role to play. Thank you.
Thank you, witnesses, for your testimony. Again, Mr. Unger, I apologize. We can also confirm the World Program posted that the recent pause concerning in-kind food assistance to WFP has been rescinded. This allows for resumption of food purchases and deliveries
Madam Chair?
visiting USAID.
Madam Chair, are we going member to member, or do you get to make a speech in between each witness? If you're going to offer evidence or
you're
testimony,
you're not
you should be
recognized.
in the clock.
You're not recognized. It's
Sure I
my
am.
time.
Sure I am.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. And this committee, based on this hearing and witness testimonies, will consider recommending investigations and criminal referrals. When Joe Biden was president, his son Hunter was on the board of a Ukrainian energy company called Burisma. The prosecutor general of Ukraine at the time, Viktor Shokin, was investigating Burisma for corruption. Biden threatened, and is on video, to withhold $1 billion of USAID grant to Ukraine if Shokin wasn't fired. Mr. Primorak, is USAID supposed to be used as leverage by a president to protect his son?
No, we call that corruption.
Mr. Primorak, in your estimation, roughly what percentage of USAID funding is doled out to bad actors or to efforts that don't have the best interests of Americans in mind?
I think what troubles me most is learning, I believe last year, following the hard work of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and Senator Joni Ernst, that USAID has been paying out over 50% to overhead charges. The Office of Inspector General of USAID criticized the agency for not knowing the overhead charges being handed out to all of these actors for $142 billion of disbursements. That is extremely troubling.
Yes. Mr. Primorak, Samantha Power, Biden's USAID administrator, openly spoke about her agency's efforts to promote democracy around the world. In your estimation, Mr. Primorak, is that what she was doing? If not, what was USAID doing during the Biden administration?
Let me cite the Holy Father, Pope Francis, who accused USAID and other donors of promoting ideological colonization, pushing a radical ideology onto the developing world that is anti-family and anti-life.
It has been asserted that USAID spent tens of millions of American taxpayer dollars to promote propaganda in Brazil in the lead up to the Bolsonaro-Lula election in 2022. It has been claimed that this funding was used to pass censorship laws and silence Bolsonaro's online presence, and even bar him from running for office in the future. Mr. Primorak, can you offer any insight into these allegations, or at least comment on whether the U.S. should play a role in toppling democratic processes around the world?
I think what we saw was USAID weaponized by the Biden administration and by Samantha Power to attack any party that was conservative. It just didn't happen in Brazil. It also happened, for instance, in very pro-America, Poland and Hungary as well.
One of the most extensive examples of regime change operations fueled by USAID is that of their role in the Syrian civil war aimed at toppling Bashar al-Assad. Reports from DD Geopolitics and other sources estimate that USAID funneled over $15 billion into Syria over a decade. covertly funding opposition groups, mercenaries, and anti-government networks under the cover of humanitarian aid. This included support for militant factions and propaganda efforts, often in collaboration with the National Endowment for Democracy. The operation culminated in Assad's overthrow in 2024 by Western-backed groups, with USAID's financial trails documented in congressional budget reports and criticized by Syrian officials as interference masses assistance. Mr. Roman, do these kinds of activities carried out by an American agency make Americans safer at home, or do they risk embroiling us in more deadly and costly foreign conflicts?
When the agency is doing it according to the way in which represents American national security interests, it's correct. But when it's abused for political purposes, ideological umbrage, and sponsoring Islamism, which is inherently anti-American, it is the worst exhaustion of American taxpayer money that can be thought of, especially when it leads to the loss and danger to American lives.
In 2014, during the Euromaidan uprising in Ukraine, which led to the ousting of President Viktor Yanukovych, USAID is estimated to have spent billions of dollars on civil society initiatives that were allegedly designed to destabilize the pro-Russian government. USAID specifically funded NGOs and media outlets that amplified the anti-Yanukovych sentiment in an effort to align Ukraine more closely with the West. We also know that 9 out of 10 of Ukraine's major media outlets receive funding from USAID. Mr. Roman, should Americans' tax dollars be funding propaganda?
When it's pro-American propaganda, yes. But if it's supporting another regime which is inherently anti-American, no, it should have no involvement with that, which is the pattern we've seen under the Biden and Obama administrations.
Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and good morning. I appreciate that this committee is going to shed some light on what's going on at USAID, but I do really wish that our friend with his golden chainsaw would drop on by because, you know what, Mr. Musk, we really would like to know what you're up to. And so far, our friends across the aisle have shielded you from appearing in front of Congress. So come on down. Bring your chainsaw. We'll be happy to host you. Let's dive into some of our questions with the witnesses here. Mr. Primorak, I appreciate your federal service. Thank you for serving as a Fed. I hope that you do not share some of the same sentiments we've heard here in Congress over the last several days, that our federal workers are somehow enemies of the state, but in fact are selfless, dedicated individuals who serve our federal government and dedicate their life to this work. And I understand that you were the author of the USAID chapter, Project 2025. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And I was intrigued to read it last night because there was a number of things that I agreed with, both in your testimony and in the chapter. In fact, some of the things that I agreed about are that U.S. foreign aid is a powerful tool, that it should align with national security interests, that we should not be empowering foreign adversaries. And I, too, am also deeply concerned about autocratic regimes like our adversaries in China, who are aggressively investing in soft power at the expense of the United States. And I also agree strongly with all the witnesses that we need reforms to our foreign aid, that we need more oversight, vetting, auditing, and inspection of what is going on. However, and I recognize that, Mr. Primorak, you didn't really touch on this in your oral testimony here today. I was surprised that in Project 2025 and some of your other statements that one of the primary areas that you really have disagreed with the foreign aid that has happened under other administrations is in the areas specifically of climate change, LGBTQ rights issues, and promoting diversity and DEI. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And although you did not testify as much today here about these issues, I want to just make sure you do believe in climate change, correct?
Climate change, sure.
Yes.
Climate changes all the time. I'm a big reader of history.
Yes.
You can see throughout the millennia.
Absolutely. And you understand that right now our allies in the Pacific who are on the front lines in pushing back against Chinese authoritarianism are requesting climate assistance from the United States because they are facing some of the most extreme impacts of climate change, correct?
Well, According to USAID
Just, it's just a
document,
yes or no, sir. You
there's been a
understand
drop
that
of
about our
99%
Pacific allies, right?
of people killed by climate change, 99% drop.
Sir, the
So it's not
question is,
radicalism,
do
it's good
you
infrastructure.
understand that our Pacific allies, who we have defense agreements and compacts with, are asking the United States for climate assistance as for the exchange to provide a place for the United States, for example, to push back against Chinese authoritarianism? You understand that, correct?
Yes, under Trump 1,
Yes.
we were
Okay,
helping
so
those
that
islands.
is why we are involved in providing financial assistance and foreign aid around climate change, in addition to the fact that it is a global threat. Now, I understand that you also, and I'm not even going to use the language here because I very much disagree with it, but I just want to ask, you agree that LGBTQ people exist and have human rights, right?
Absolutely, we were
Yeah.
doing that under Trump
Okay.
1.
And you also agree that our governments and our institutions should look like and reflect the people that they represent, especially overseas? It's part of being able to actually engage with foreign governments, correct?
If we want to do counter China, there's nothing more that has
I'm
alienated
asking
billions
you a
of
very
people than pushing
straightforward
an
question.
ideology that they resent.
Okay. Well, I see that you're not interested in engaging in the conversation. And while we can agree to disagree, I'll take this as a difference in values, maybe worldview. But I just want to point out here that this perfectly aligns with what the Trump administration is doing in trying to gut programs around diversity, equity, inclusion, supporting LGBTQ rights and human rights overseas, and climate change, and helping our allies overseas. And this is not waste, fraud, and abuse. This is a different worldview. You can't just call something waste, fraud, and abuse because you disagree with it. Now, Mr. O'Neill, it's nice to see you here again. Oh, I am out of time, and I will circle back. Thank you.
I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and I appreciate you holding this hearing. I appreciate you witnesses for being here. It's been astonishing to watch. We already knew that there was a tremendous amount of waste, fraud, and abuse in our federal government, but to watch over the last few weeks as the extent and egregiousness of it has been revealed. I've said a number of times how aggravating it is that this government is forcing the American people to pay for the demise of their own country. We've seen this a number of times, especially in how foreign aid is treated. And much of this funding, we're realizing now, as Mr. O'Neill has pointed out, we're uncovering is the world's largest money laundering scheme in history. And so I would like to think that if these kind of things were put to a vote, that our friends on the left wouldn't vote to support a pickle maker in the Ukraine, or to have transgender operas in other countries, or to send people to Paris Fashion Week and the like. I would like to think if that was a vote, that would also get a no vote on the other side of the aisle, that this is stuff that is not necessarily, the taxpayer dollars shouldn't be funding. But you got to wonder about the vitriol you see when these things come uncovered to protect these things. Now, definitely the border trafficking institution that was set up, the complete industry, the censorship apparatus, those are examples where we really saw that these taxpayer dollar funds were going to these NGOs that were purely leftist organizations that were turning out voters and getting all this, basically being a campaign front at taxpayer expense. And so you got to wonder how this is happening, because this is not in the legislation. There's no line item in a legislation that has these sort of things in it. So, Mr. Permack, I'd like to ask you, where are these decisions being made? Who's making the decisions about where these dollars go?
This is a combination of cooperation between the Congress and the White House. I can tell you that during my tenure at USAID, everything that we did had strong bipartisan support. Unfortunately, when President Biden came in...
But it's someone in an agency somewhere, is that right, making the decision? How's that decision made? Who's making that decision? Like,
that is
before the check goes out, who's pushing the button that says, send this check?
It starts with the administrator, goes down to the bureau level and the office level. But in the end, contract officers have to make sure at the Office of Acquisition Procurement that these are following U.S. laws and the policies of the president.
Contract officers. Now, are these people elected? We hear a lot about elected officials making these, certain decisions within
There's
our
no one
government.
at USAID that is elected.
So, yeah, so the people sending the money are not elected officials. Okay, just wanted to clarify that. One of the issues we've had is trying to track this dollars once it goes out to bring accountability to it. And there is no connection that we've been able to find to an employee ID number, for example, connected to where the grant money is going out or the contract money is going out. We're working on legislation to fix that. But one of the things that's really disturbing is the fact that some of the money that's going out doesn't even have a name of where it's going out. You talked about that, Mr. Roman. Could you speak to that for a second? It's to the tune of billions of dollars.
Correct. Miscellaneous foreign awardees. The issue with it is that while the individual grantees have to apply for a vetting process that USAID conducts in terms of a government review, including with counterterrorism databases, there's a self-certification process by their sub-grantees. It's as if though you hire a contractor in your house to redo your living room, and he hires a bunch of robbers to take everything out, and you're left with the spades on the wall rather than having a fully renovated room itself.
And so some of these dollars have been going to support terrorist organizations.
Right. And
taxpayer dollars going to support. Now, what would happen if we found a business that was funneling money to the Taliban?
They would be indicted. They would be charged, go before trial, and go to jail for a 20-year sentence for money laundering or for material support for terrorism.
So this is one of those cases where it's only legal if the government's doing it?
Right. In the opening chairman's remarks, she was saying that this is about fraud, waste, and abuse, and if it was anyone else, it's as if though a private citizen can't do this, but if a U.S. government agency or bureaucrat wants to give money to a terror organization, it's okay.
Yeah, I find that atrocious. I think the American people do too. Mr. Perback, I want to touch on one thing because I've talked to ambassadors across the world, and you hear this. We'd like to align ourselves with the United States. We don't want to align ourselves with China, but when we're talking to China, they're talking roads, bridges, infrastructure, those kind of things. Things we traditionally know as soft power. But right now, when they're talking to the United States, what they've gotten from our State Department over the last few years is social reengineering. Many of them have come to say, our nation espouses Judeo-Christian values. They don't. And even as I talk to pastors across our country who are working to send millions into missionaries, their eyes in Christian universities to understand the fact that our State Department is actually sending billions to counteract those ideals. Could you speak to that?
You can quickly answer, and we have to move on.
I've spoken to many foreign African officials, for example. When they're meeting with Mr. Blinken, they were ready to talk counter-genocide. Instead, they got to social reengineering.
Okay. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I want to thank the witnesses for helping the committee with its work. I've been here a while, so I was here actually when President George W. Bush was confronted with wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And in the midst of that, members of this committee, I was in the lead because I was chair of the National Security Subcommittee. We went to Iraq and Afghanistan, and we vetted some of the billions of dollars that the president spent over there. Some of it was wisely spent in the best interest of protecting our sons and daughters in uniform. Others purely wasted that I think fell into the hands of our enemies. I think that has been true of every administration that has tried as they might to strengthen America's national security by investments abroad. I do want to say that what troubles me greatly is that now we have a cessation of all foreign aid. And, just take Ukraine, for example. I know it's been $174 billion in aid from the U.S. to Ukraine. It's important to note that that $174 billion, most of it was spent here in the United States and paying defense workers and defense contractors and putting Americans to work. 90% of that on the defense side. And then when you look at the grain shipments that we have made, not only to Ukraine but to others, because obviously their agricultural systems are inoperable right now, those are American farmers. And Madam Chair, I would like to ask for unanimous consent just to submit this article from the Associated Press entitled "The USAID Shutdown is Upending the Livelihoods of Farmers and Other Americans."
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, and what also troubles me is that now we have a president saying that Ukraine started the war. And Mr. Ullman, you're a really smart guy. You're up on this stuff. You pay attention. Do you seriously believe that that Zelensky invaded Russia? Okay.
No, sir.
Okay. I'm just happy to hear you say that. I expected that, but look, members on this committee, some are new, so some weren't there, but we all sat in classified briefings for months where our defense and intelligence personnel would brief us and say, okay, this week Vladimir Putin is moving his armored divisions from Vladivostok in eastern Russia, 4,000 miles, and positioning them in front of the Ukraine border, anticipating an invasion. And then, afterwards, after the invasion, actually 2020, I think it was, Putin took credit, said, I ordered the special operation against Ukraine. And yet, we have a president saying the opposite. He's saying that Ukraine invaded Russia. They started the war. And it's just, to restate Mr. Primarak's question, was there one Republican in the room that raised their hand and said, no, Mr. President, that is a lie. That is false. I didn't hear anything. Not one of my colleagues corrected the president and stood up to him and said, no, Mr. President. No, Mr. President. It was Russia. It was Russia that started that war. They invaded Ukraine. And it's right for the U.S. to stand with Ukraine and their people. I didn't hear any of that. That's what troubles me. I had instances where I agreed with George W. Bush on some things. And I had plenty that I disagreed with. But, that's Congress's role here. That's our job, to call out the truth to power. And so this idea that all foreign aid should be suspended is an attack on common sense. It's an attack on American national security for this country, and we should be more careful. I agree. Let's look at the areas where we're spending foreign aid in an area and in a way that is good for U.S. national security, and let's get rid of the stuff, some of it you've already pointed out, that is not in our central interest. That's a good process that I would like to engage in. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My colleagues across the aisle are quick to judge the actions of this president in the early days of his administration. But I didn't hear any loud voices from across the aisle when President Biden, who was clearly experiencing severe cognitive decline, ran this country. I don't even know who was running the country. I don't know who was making the decisions. I don't know how those decisions were being formed and who was signing the executive orders he was engaging in. So it's just very rich that I'm hearing all of these concerns about President Trump's efforts to negotiate peace in Ukraine and the manner in which he's going about it. And I hate it, but I think I have to set the record straight, because President Trump and his team went to Munich to the security conference just weeks ago, and they were engaged in diplomacy. They were trying to create an opportunity for the United States to have a financial and economic interest in the future of Ukraine. And that was through a minerals deal. The U.S. has a strategic interest in having a long-term supply chain for rare earth minerals. And so President Trump said, we can get on board with this. Let's do this. It might not be the NATO membership that they want, but it's a close second. And so your concern is related to those conversations, because Zelensky originally said, yes, let's do it. That sounds like a good deal. And then within 24 hours, he backtracked. He did a 180. And he actually started disparaging President Trump. And he was disparaging the administration. So, yeah, President Trump said some things and tried to create pressure to then bring Zelensky back to the table. Whoa, guess what? Guess who's on the way to Washington to sign the minerals deal? So I get it that my colleagues across the aisle want to throw stones at everything that President Trump does. My favorite was when President Trump was engaging with Canada and Mexico, and the Democrats didn't even have time to throw stones at his attempt to bring them to the table to secure their side of the border, because it only took them 4 or 5 hours to come to the table. The articles hadn't even gone to print yet. So look, President Trump is going to negotiate peace in Ukraine. He's going to bring all of our hostages home in Gaza, and he has deserved the leeway. Now to the issue at hand, USAID. 77 million people voted for President Trump because we are out of balance. The Biden administration, whoever was running the show, engaged in ridiculous policies that the American people disagree with, whether it's with DEI or trans policies, whatever it is. We're turning the page, and we're not going to abdicate our leadership in the global community. We're going to hit reset because we are so out of balance that all we can do is go to zero and then build back. Because we're not going to spend $2 million on sex changes in Guatemala or $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. These are ridiculous policies that the American people have overwhelmingly said they do not want. So, Mr. Roman, to the issue at hand. How do we make sure when we get our foreign aid back running that we don't give money to terrorists? That's a great question.
So there's 4 recommendations that I would offer. The first is no more miscellaneous listings, as we had heard from the gentleman before. We have to use public vetting processes that require complete transparency, encourage independent audits, and mandate
Can we go
strict
back
screening.
to that? Why did we not have transparency before?
I have, for the last 18 months, been trying to get information about a grant made to what we believe is a Hamas affiliate, and the Freedom of Information Act Department, or the Freedom of Information Officer at USAID, has stonewalled me for the last year and a half. And this goes back all the way to 2015. It's as if though
Bureaucrats think they know better.
Bureaucrats think they know better.
Guess what? We're going to create transparency across all of government. And that is what President Trump is doing through Elon Musk. Elon Musk has been asked by the president to serve, and he is going to bring transparency not just to USAID, to every single nook and cranny of the government, because that is what the American people want. And it's 2025. We have the ability to do that. Mr. Roman, continue. What else can we do to make sure?
I'll go quick. I know we're limited. Stronger accountability mechanisms, clawback provisions, stiff penalties for misuse, criminal investigations if you go towards the terrorism financing. The State Department, under Secretary Rubio's review, must have a roadmap for better oversight. And lastly, the legislature must give teeth to its funding bills. We have to be able to have robust penalties, transparency mandates, and real-time oversight tools rather than waiting 3 years to get reports from contractors when they've already committed the violation past the statute of limitations.
I'm out of time. We all know sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that's the path forward. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. A member of the public audience made an obscene gesture. It was caught on camera to a member of Congress. I would like to remind everyone in the hearing room to follow the rules of decorum. Capitol Police will now remove the offender, and I expect members of the audience to maintain decorum. We'll take a pause for a brief moment.
Point of order or a point of clarification, Madam Chair. Okay. Well, never mind.
Do you have a parliamentary inquiry?
Nope.
Okay.
I'm okay now.
Okay. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you to our ranking member, our chairwoman, and I want to thank our witnesses for also for being here today. Thank you all for joining us. So this is obviously our second hearing on DOGE, and certainly as Elon Musk and Donald Trump work together to destroy our federal agencies. Now, a lot has happened in just the last few weeks since DOGE has been off raiding the federal agencies that we care so much about. We know that FAA staff have been fired, making our airspace less safe. Veterans Affairs staff have been fired, risking services for our vets. Food safety and health staff have been fired as we face a bird flu pandemic. And all of our agencies have been thrown into chaos by Elon Musk's emails demanding, of course, that federal workers respond to what they're doing in the last week, which he's now had to, of course, retract. Now, we're here today to discuss Elon's attack on foreign aid, which has been severe. And I want to also bring again, this is a pic of co-president Elon Musk, who, of course, is leading DOGE. And I brought this pic, of course, to our last hearing. And I know some folks were upset by it. But just to be clear, we know that Elon Musk is dangerous, he's incompetent, he's chaotic, and he's killing programs that we rely on. We know that he's helping to push through massive cuts to Medicaid that could rip health care away from millions. He's pushing tax cuts that will benefit him and his billionaire friends. And he is causing real harm to federal workers. Now, some of Mr. Musk's most damaging actions have actually been towards USAID, which we're discussing today. Over 14,000 adults and 1,500 infants have now been estimated to have possibly died because of the Trump administration's attack on AIDS treatment programs that are actually ongoing, as we know. They're hurting real people and damaging our national security. Now, if you look at this chart, and you look at all spending in the government, and you want to look at foreign aid, of course, of which USAID is a part of, it's less than 1% of our total budget. USAID spends around $40 billion per year. Around $40 billion per year of this entire federal budget. Meanwhile, other parts of the budget, including, for example, the Defense Department, spend almost 16% of all federal spending in fiscal year 2025. In fact, about half of other discretionary spending in this chart. Now, the Department of Defense is the only agency to never pass an audit. USAID actually passes audits all the time. And yet we're attacking the one agency that actually is able to pass an audit while we leave untouched the agency, of course, that can't even pass an audit. Last year, the Department of Defense failed to account for 63% of its assets. Trillions of dollars worth of equipment haven't been properly documented. And it's not just their failure to pass an audit. I want to just quickly ask about some key programs that are over budget and behind schedule. This, of course, we know here is the F-35 fighter jet. Will cost us $2 trillion over the course of its life cycle. These planes are often delivered late. They often cannot fly. And right now, we know that the F-35 is $183 billion over budget. Mr. Unger, which is more, the $183 billion cost overrun of the F-35 or the entire USAID budget?
The former that you mentioned, sir.
And this is the Littoral Combat Ship. The Navy, by the way, thinks this is basically useless in actual combat. Could have a lifetime cost of over $100 billion, according to ProPublica. Mr. Unger, that's also way more than the entire USAID budget. Is that right?
Yes, way more.
Thank you. And I also want to just ask you about the Central Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Program, which has seen its costs soar over 81% during its program cycle. It costs $141 billion with cost overruns and soaring program cost. Mr. Unger, you know what I'm going to ask you, but is $141 billion more than the entire USAID budget?
Absolutely.
Mr. Unger, Elon Musk and his companies have received about almost $40 billion in government contracts, loans, subsidies, and tax credits. That amount, that roughly $40 billion, is basically enough to run USAID for an entire year. Is that correct, Mr. Unger?
That is correct for USAID's budget and the programs that it manages.
The majority isn't talking about Elon Musk programs or asking them here to testify. They're attacking USAID and are supporting a billionaire who gets richer every single day. We got to push back every single time. And with that, I yield back.
I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Mr. Roman, are you aware that we are sending $40 million a week to the Taliban?
Yes, sir.
Can you name other instances of foreign aid going to terrorist organizations?
We have assisted al-Shabaab in Somalia. There's been instances of the Hamzi network in Sudan, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Kataib al-Hezbollah, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams in Syria. Dozens of terror organizations have received indirect assistance from U.S. foreign aid.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the mechanisms in place that are to stop foreign aid from going to terrorist groups, and why are they not working if we have any in place?
Sure.
And I would note that these are, you notice these are terrorist weaponry. You see some AKs, SKSs, some snipers, some clips, some clip carriers probably made in China, and I believe these are small landmines here beside right there.
Let's use Gaza as our case study. $2.1 billion in American taxpayers' money to Gaza since October 7th when Hamas invaded southern Israel. USAID money was going in terms of an emergency use authorization to try to go to parties that USAID formerly had a relationship with in the Gaza Strip. They had to have been vetted by OFAC. They should have been vetted against the special designated terror list from the State Department and from other Treasury organizations. Waivers were granted because they said that there was an emergency use to have that money come in to Gaza, thereby jettisoning the usual typical screening procedures. As a result, 90% of aid that was going from the United States by way of its agents in Gaza ended up in Hamas-controlled areas. And this is ridiculous. Essentially, what the U.S. assistance to Gaza did was underwrite the ability for Hamas to survive until the ceasefire was just passed a few weeks ago. There was no strategic thought for it, and there was no screening.
Seems like the emergency might have been armed terrorists to kill civilians. Would that be accurate?
That's accurate, and even more than that, Samantha Powers, the administrator for USAID, was intent on having Israel not be able to defend itself.
To not be able to defend it.
Correct.
Mr. Primorak, is that correct? How do you say that? Primorak? I got Burchett, man. Nobody gets mine right, so don't worry about it. What is it, Primorak?
Perfect.
All right, thanks, brother. How did terrorists exploit our foreign aid loopholes?
Well, we have a lot of our international.
Can you pull your mic up? I'm sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
You have international NGOs and UN agencies actively lobby here in Washington, D.C. against vetting policies that would prevent it. I was the senior vetting officer at USAID, and what we did.
Did you say United Nations is doing this? The UN?
Sure, everybody who's getting money lobbies here.
That they're lobbying against us. I'm sorry, Mr. Roman.
There's actually someone who used to work for one of those lobbies, the largest NGO lobby, Interaction. One of our co-witnesses here worked for them from 2018 to 2023. USAID effectively self-funds its own external private lobby that then goes back to Congress and asks for more money for USAID.
So the taxpayers fund this lobbyist who's working against American interests.
Correct.
Possibly killing our allies and possibly Americans.
They bring together groups in Washington that overseas work with groups that kill Americans.
Yeah, I don't need a flow chart to show that. I appreciate it. Do you think USAID programs have been aligned with the national security interests of the U.S.?
No, they have not. They have actually helped China.
Mr. Roman?
No.
Okay. How do these programs compromise our national security, Mr. Primorak?
They actually push China. They actually push much of the world towards China on the green energy agenda. They push people, ordinary people, billions of people towards China because of the resentment caused by our social re-engineering.
Are we being lobbied by these pro-communist China groups currently?
But a lot of these countries don't even have to lobby because they get the money anyway, like South Africa.
Yeah, and in fact, these lobbyists have come to the House and have tried to kill legislation like H.R. 160, which was meant to increase transparency in USAID's funding of overseas organizations.
Is that a current piece of legislation?
That's from the last session.
And give me that number again.
H.R. 160.
And what does it do?
It was meant to give U.S. lawmakers the ability to have higher transparency in terror financing investigations aimed at scrutinizing extremist groups.
Mr. Primorak?
We had a regulation before we left in the last administration that anybody who touches money in countries where there's terrorists, those names have to go through databases, terrorist databases. That was overturned by Biden.
Overturned by Biden. Chair Lady, I am currently 5 seconds, but I wanted to mention something. There's a lot of rhetoric used on this committee, and I would urge my friends on both sides of the aisle, let's stick to the actual information. this rhetoric is, I've received death threats, and I know the chair lady has, and it needs to stop. We need to tone it down. Thank you, chair lady, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett.
Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to ask for unanimous consent to enter a few items into the record relating to the waivers that have been provided by the Secretary. And because Mr. Burchett just went now, there is some reporting, and perhaps he's in the room if he'd like to respond, Madam Chair. In this reporting, it says that Representative Burchett told a reporter that he has a real problem with a report that 2 DOGE employees blocked PEPFAR funding that should have been granted a waiver by the Secretary, and said that if it was a mistake, they should have been fired. We also have numerous reports here that these waivers may exist, but they are not being enforced, and there are thousands of federal aid workers across the world right now that are stranded, as well as international aid that is sitting in ports and docks.
If you have the documentation without objection.
I'm not sure if my name was besmirched. If I'm allowed to respond or not, it's fine either way.
No, it's just a report. I'm not.
Okay, but anybody that works for the president that goes against what he says, he has a right to fire them. So, thank you.
Absolutely. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Kassar, for 5 minutes.
I'm going to do something that I've never done in a congressional hearing before, and that is plead for help from the American people, plead for help from my Republican colleagues on something that we actually all agree on, because lives are at stake right now. I'm going to start by describing the facts on the ground. Millions of people are at risk of dying of starvation in areas of the world where Democrats and Republicans have already agreed and committed to feeding them with American-grown food for humanitarian reasons and for global stability. But yesterday, I spoke with people in charge of warehouses in Sudan and Ethiopia, warehouses full of food, but because of DOGE, that food is trapped in the warehouse out of reach of starving and dying moms and kids. In those 2 countries alone, 150,000 children and moms are at risk of dying this month if that food is not delivered from the warehouse to them right up the road. Everyone agrees that's not supposed to happen. Republicans voted for this food, and Democrats voted for this food to get out. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the food should go out as part of his life-saving waiver. DOGE Chairwoman Marjorie Taylor Greene started this hearing by saying that life-saving food programs should still be running. We have paid for the food, and we have shipped it, and it is sitting trapped in the warehouse because DOGE is blocking the payments needed to get the food out to the people who need it. So here's what that means. It means that kids are dying, and more will die tomorrow, of severe acute malnutrition. If you want nightmares, just Google severe acute malnutrition and look at the photos. The way that healthcare workers determine if a kid is dying of this is they measure their bicep. And if their bicep is less than 4.5 inches around, then that means you could die of starvation tomorrow. Think of a kid's arm fitting through this hole. Think of your kid's arm fitting through this hole. These kids could die tomorrow. You've heard today about the waiver for life-saving humanitarian assistance, and all I'm asking is for Rubio's waiver to be made real. People watching at home, you can do something about this. I know many of these hearings are live on Fox News. I'm a Democrat. For many of the people watching, you may not agree with me on many issues, but I think we can all agree that this food needs to get out of the warehouse and to these kids. I've gotten phone calls from conservative friends, people of faith that moved to Africa to live out their faith of I was naked and you clothed me, I was hungry and you fed me, and they agree that this food should be given out. So call your Republican congressperson, call the White House, tell them you know they didn't mean to do this, but that this food needs to go out tomorrow. If you're in the press, cover this story. Ask questions about Ethiopia. Ask questions about Sudan. Tell the world about this. And to my Republican colleagues, DOGE is not going to listen to me, but you can fix this. Pick up the phone, make a phone call. Y'all could save lives today. Send an email. Please, put politics aside, get the food out of the warehouse, save these kids' lives. You can save these kids' lives. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields without objection, and I'm entering for the record a post from the World Food Program that states we can confirm that the recent pause concerning in-kind food assistance to WFP purchased from U.S. farmers with Title II funds has been rescinded. This allows for the resumption of food purchases and deliveries under existing USAID agreements. It also enables WFP to continue working with our NGO partners who play a vital role in distributing emergency food assistance to people affected by war, floods, droughts, and other disasters around the world. WFP continues to work closely with the U.S. counterparts and all our donors to ensure consistent, uninterrupted emergency food assistance to hunger hotspots that span Sudan, South Sudan, Gaza, Haiti, and other crisis areas. I now recognize the gentleman, where's my list? Now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Burleson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and good morning to our witnesses. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between real charity and fake charity or phony charity. Real charity is an individual seeing a need, feeling the love in their heart, the compassion for their fellow man, digging money out of their own pocket and giving it to the people in need. Government charity, fake charity, is taking from somebody else and giving it to whoever you think that you want to give it to. Let's call this USAID program for what it actually is. It is a disgraceful betrayal of the American taxpayer. It's all under the guise of being charity, but for years, the Democrats have turned USAID into their personal slush fund, funneling billions of our hard-earned tax dollars into a cesspool of left-wing propaganda, all masquerading under the guise of charitable aid. And what did we get for it? Not stronger allies, not safer borders, and hardly a dime's worth for the American interest. No, we got absurdity for it. Taxpayer cash bankrolling climate activism, DEI, that are frequently at odds with the values and the needs of the countries that we're supposedly aiding. This isn't aid. It's a shakedown of our taxpayers, courtesy of the left-wing bureaucracy working with dark money networks that Mr. O'Neill described so eloquently earlier. Now, I have a question for Mr. Roman. As DOGE has recently brought to the forefront, USAID has often used American tax dollars to push leftist ideology abroad. One of these areas is exporting radical renewable energy agenda, which I believe is not only not in the best interest of the U.S., but it's also detrimental to the very countries that the aid is supposed to be helping, subsidized by anti-competitive energy policy. Can you touch on the impact that this policy has?
Without being a meteorologist or climatologist or a geologist, I can't necessarily speak about energy, but I can speak more largely about the sponsorship of agendas which are anathema to American interests abroad. Specifically in the report that we published about 3 weeks ago, we were finding that there were special interests who would come to USAID contract officers, they would make recommendations, and it was basically the granting like a political commissar in the Soviet Union would do to his favorite unit, rather than looking at what was actually good for the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Pimarack, it was once quoted by Samantha Power. She declared that USAID is a climate agency. And so DOGE recently canceled 10 climate and clean energy programs, including a nearly $85 million award aimed at increasing clean energy in Africa. Also, a $18.7 million program for electric vehicles to be adopted in Nepal. My question to you is Is USAID a climate agency?
They wasted a lot of money on it. I can't think of any other agenda that has caused as much poverty and hunger as the climate agenda. For example, the higher energy cost hits the poor the hardest. For poor farmers in Africa that have to rely on natural gas-based fertilizers, it became too expensive, so crop yields just plummeted. And these countries at the same time were prevented from developing their own fossil fuel industries in which they could generate the income to finance their own social services.
Thank you. And my last question has to do with the promotion of values outside of, outside of the values of the United States and Western culture. As a member of Congress, I've had diplomats from other countries come meet with me in my office and beg us to stop using the aid that we're sending to their country as a leverage point to force them into doing things that their countries find abhorrent. One of those is the promotion of abortion. USAID is being used to push ideologies, including abortion ideology, across the globe. In fact, during the Biden administration, one of his first actions was to sign a memorandum reinstituting the foreign aid to abortion programs. But Mr. O'Neill, that jeopardized the same funding that was supposed to be helping people with AIDS.
Yeah, we've seen throughout the Biden administration the impact of these far-left organizations propped up by the left's dark money network, pushing a host of causes, particularly on abortion. I have a big chapter talking about the prosecution of pro-life protesters.
Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Crockett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to see if we can level set, because I don't know if people truly understand the point of USAID. First of all, can I just ask you really quickly, each of you, yes or no? Do you believe that soft power matters? Yes or no, Mr. Unger?
Yes.
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 Absolutely.
Okay, so for the American people, because I don't know that there's been a conversation about soft power, but soft power is basically our way of building diplomacy around the world. And so how we build that diplomacy probably looks different in every different administration. But the issue that I have right now is that some would argue that we've taken a butcher knife where we need a scalpel, or others would just say that we are throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But either way, we are not accomplishing our goal, because as it's been laid out, we have people that have gone hungry, we have people that have died. So let me try to make sure that people understand what it is that soft power is, which is building diplomacy. The next part of that I want you to understand, those of you that are watching, is that as members of Congress, we do have congressional oversight to the extent that we actually travel the world. We go, we sit down with world leaders, we talk to them about the programs that we have, we talk to them about trade. We also have an opportunity to go and visit and talk and see exactly how our dollars are being spent. And if you are a good member of Congress, you do that. And I do want to tell you about an experience in Africa, but I got to get through these other remarks. So if I have a chance, I'm going to tell you why I believe in this with my whole heart. We all know that my Republican colleagues have a weird fetish with dictators or wannabe dictators. So it should not come as a surprise that they're here attacking global democracy programs. For 6 decades, USAID has been vital in reducing global poverty and hunger, helping to resolve health threats like the Ebola outbreak, which reached Dallas, where I represent, in 2014, and countering regional threats from Russia and China. Not only is pro-Putin President Trump threatening economic warfare against our closest allies and partners, he's blaming Ukraine for Russia's invasion, threatening military force against Greenland, and starting tariff wars with Canada and Mexico. He's also defying a court order to release billions of dollars in U.S. foreign aid. This committee should be providing oversight of the executive branch's illegal impoundment of federal funds. But we're here today so that the chairwoman can peddle new conspiracy theories about U.S. foreign aid. The dismantling of USAID is just another part of the Republicans' chaotic foreign policy and pro-dictator agenda. Republicans are turning their backs on American farmers who provide nearly half of USAID's global food assistance. I'm going to stop here really quickly, because I think what happens is that when the American people hear that we're sending out money, they believe that we're just dropping bags of money places. And that's not what we do. But let me tell you, China does. China does, because I've sat down and I've talked to people, and one of the reasons that we are behind China is because they have argued that there is no red tape, and China is like gangsters. Like, think about the biggest, baddest guy offering you money when you want it, like a loan shark, right? And then when they come back to get their money, they want your firstborn, your secondborn, and everybody else. That is who China is. But a lot of people that are desperate for money, they go for that, because in America, we're going to say, no, no, no. We're going to take care of our farmers. We're going to make sure that our farmers are the ones that are giving you the food. We're going to make sure that if you want arms, those arms are going to come from us. So I want people to understand, we don't just go with black bags and drop off bags of money like that. It's not that simple. But I want to get to a couple of questions because I know I'm running out of time. Mr. Unger, the chairwoman stated that, quote, the federal government has been sending billions after billions of dollars to push left-wing ideology, fund radical extremist groups, and usurp the will of the people abroad and here at home. Is saving 20 million lives through the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, or PEPFAR, part of some left-wing ideology? Yes or no?
No, in fact,
Okay, I gotta
PEPFAR
go.
was created by Republicans.
It was created by Republicans. Thank you for that fact. In fact, it was a Bush, a Texan. What about eradicating polio in nearly every country and cutting malaria deaths in half?
No.
Okay. So here's the other thing, and I don't know if anybody knows the answer to this question. We have been talking about USAID and trying to pretend like it's the devil, but when we look at the numbers, is it 50% of our budget that goes to USAID, Mr. Unger? Yes or no?
The money that goes to AID is less than 1 cent if all of the federal budget is $1.
Thank you. It is less than 1% of our budget. So we are focusing on less than 1% instead of the other 99%. I need the American people to wake up and recognize and start asking questions about these other areas, such as
The
where
gentlelady's
line
time
of
has
is money.
expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Jack, for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman, Chairwoman, I wanted to ask for unanimous consent to enter an article into the record from this morning. It is an article from the Washington Post this morning titled, Judge Orders Trump Administration to Pay Millions in USAID Funds that the UN World Food Program is owed more than $820 million in funds, from just this morning.
Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Jack?
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I want to commend you for holding hearings, trying to ensure that the taxpayer dollars is held accountable. Our last hearing, I just want to note for the record, we discussed the $2.7 trillion over the last 20 years that has been distributed through improper payments and wasted, taxpayer dollars wasted over the last 20 years, $2.7 trillion. And one of the things I want to talk about today are some of the general waste, fraud, and abuse we've seen within the USAID program. So if I could start with Mr. Primorak, what was USAID's original mission and mandate, and how has the agency strayed from those initial priorities from your perspective?
It was started in the 1960s to combat Soviet imperialism, communist imperialism, and it did a good job. It responded to a lot of natural disasters, did a good job, helped to integrate former Warsaw Pact countries as allies of the United States, did a good job, but during the Clinton administration, but especially afterwards in the Obama administration, and it went full scale under the Biden administration, started pushing a social reengineering agenda.
And if I can speak to that for a moment, what would you say are the main deficiencies in USAID's vetting and oversight process that has led to this waste, fraud, and abuse?
It's an aid industrial complex that refuses to have accountability and oversight.
And Mr. Roman, if I could ask you just to expand upon that.
Sure. I'll give you an example of the Together Project in civic space. Islamist organizations which work with designated terror organizations in different Middle Eastern countries and territories came under attack by our organization, the Middle East Forum, back in 2017. They put together a lobby which acted as an umbrella to go to Congress to say, ignore that organization that's exposing public data about money going to radical organizations. They're so-called, quote-unquote, Islamophobic. So by using politically charged language, they try to cover up their associations with terror organizations. Then they went back to USAID, said, look, Congress is going to fund us now because we lobbied for successful bills, and they got more money.
And what steps would you say, Mr. Roman, are needed to be taken to ensure grant recipients follow the rules and cooperate with the policies in place?
I think there's a gap in vetting and enforcement, allowing funds to move both directly and indirectly to extremist-linked groups. You have to have a pipeline where all the money that's coming out of U.S. government coffers is traceable exactly to which organization and subgrantee it goes to, and then if you have $1 touch one individual, that individual or that organization has to report back to be compared against U.S. vetting databases before a check is cut to them.
And if I could ask the same question to you, Mr. Primerack, what are some steps we could take to ensure the grant recipients don't evade some of the requirements needed?
I think we need to have a consolidated website where every single award and sub-award is on there, where not only members of Congress can look at it, but the American people who fund this can go through it. And that's the kind of transparency and accountability that's going to force folks to be careful what they do.
And if I can just ask, we'll go back to Mr. Roman. I really appreciated that example. With what time I have left, could you offer any other examples of mechanisms by which entities evaded transparency requirements, something that we all talk about, and we've all seen the egregious spending across the board that's been illuminated by many members of this committee over the last 2 weeks. But when it comes to evading some of these requirements, I want to speak directly to that and enter that into the record to the extent you could share.
There's a bifurcation of the problem. One is the organizations which are abusing U.S. taxpayer dollars, but the second is the bureaucrats who are allowing them to get away with it. Sometimes because they're not looking and being blind to the issue, other times because they're intentionally pursuing an ideological agenda that Congress didn't appropriate or authorize. You have to direct funding to have individuals that are getting money to be able to authorize that money, and the reports on the grants that they make after the funding period is over should also be publicly available rather than just how much money was spent. In addition to that, there is many other individuals and partnerships that go beyond USAID. For instance, foundations supporting extremists, persistent lapses in sanctions enforcement, and also potential violations of U.S. criminal statutes. The report that we put out suggests that funding streams may have contravened laws prohibiting material support to terrorism, sanctions violations, fraud, and false statements, both by the grantees and some of the grantors.
Well, I appreciate the testimony from both of you all today and for all witnesses for appearing before the committee. Ultimately, I think what the chairwoman's been trying to do through these hearings is try to ensure that American taxpayer dollars are protected and used to the betterment of American citizens and our interests here in our country, and they're not wasted. And if I could just spend, Madam Chairwoman, the last 20 seconds of my my questioning today noting that we in our committee should have a decorum. And the other side, after our last committee hearing, which should have been a bipartisan issue, talking about waste, fraud, and abuse within government programs going out the door, shortly after that hearing, one of our committee members called for real weapons to be brought to this political debate. And I think that's atrocious. I think that's egregious. And I would just like to note, I will reclaim my time, but I'd just like to note, Madam Chairwoman, that I think
you're not recognized, Ms. Stansbury. You're not recognized.
Out of time, and you're spreading lies.
You're not recognized, Ms. Stansbury.
so. I will just close by saying we should have more decorum in this and expect it, especially from the American taxpayers who are paying our salaries to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I do want to agree with that. There was a member of this committee that went on CNN and said it's time for actual weapons to be used. That is documented. It's on video, and we will not tolerate that type of language and calls for violence on this committee. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gill, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you so much for holding this hearing today. We've heard throughout this hearing a bit more of the same shrill calumny against President Trump and Elon Musk that we've been hearing for months now. But I am happy that a few of our colleagues did concede that we need more oversight and auditing of our foreign aid. I'd like to remind them that every time Republicans try to do that and audit where government money is going, they try to stonewall us. So I hope that they will get on board with protecting the American taxpayer. I think as it relates to foreign aid, to the extent that we do engage in foreign aid, it of course should advance American strategic geopolitical interests, our commercial interests, and of course should help ameliorate major humanitarian crises. But it ought to be rooted in realism, which is a recognition that we have strategic interests abroad that we ought to advance, and it ought to be rooted in a rational conception of the way the world actually is, and not the way some leftist secular bureaucrat at USAID believes the world should be. I think that forcing transgenderism and novel sexual fetishes on more traditional cultures does not advance American interests. It alienates the United States on the world stage. We've also seen USAID money going to oppose many of our allies abroad. Madam Chair gave a few examples, and I'll give a few more here. We've seen USAID money funding efforts to influence elections in India against Prime Minister Modi. We've seen our ally Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban accusing USAID of funding left-wing media outlets that are opposing him. We've seen USAID give $12.5 million just last year to the American Near East Refugee Agency, whose staff openly called for violence against Jews. The refugee agency also funded projects of the Unlimited Friends Association, which is a proxy organization for Hamas. This is not advancing our strategic interests abroad, and these are not promoting American values. Mr. Unger, I've got a couple questions for you. You've mentioned USAID as representing American ideas in action. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you believe that spending over $3 million for being LGBTQ in the Caribbean is a reflection of American ideas in action?
I believe that the programs that are focused on global health
just
and
yes or
food
no is
security,
fine. Yes or no will
the
suffice.
programs that in global health and food security and economic growth are absolutely
I'm not.
in the interest
I'm
of
talking about being LGBTQ in the Caribbean. Is that a reflection of American values? Yes or no?
I believe the programs that you're referring to are a reflection of
I'll
human
take
rights.
that as a yes. What about spending $70,000 for the production of a DEI musical in Ireland? Is that a reflection of American ideas in action? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Do you think that spending $2 million for sex changes and LGBTQ activism in Guatemala is a reflection of American values?
The information that you are using is
Yes
so
or no?
faulty that it doesn't
It's
even
a yes or no
describe
question.
to USAID projects.
No, that is a direct description of what we're spending our tax dollars. Do you think that sex
that-
changes and LGBTQ activism in
that what you're-
Guatemala
is that coming
is an
from
accurate
DOGE?
reflection of American values abroad?
Is
It's
that
a yes
data
or no
coming
question.
from DOGE?
Is that a yes or a no?
What I want to understand
This is
the
a
data
yes or
coming
no
from
question.
DOGE? Because they counted the same
I'll take that
USAID
as-
program
you're,
3
You're not going to
times.
filibuster. Reclaiming my time here. We'll go to another one. How about $1.5 million to promote job opportunities for LGBTQ individuals in Serbia? Is that a reflection of American values?
Providing job opportunities for allies around the world is absolutely in the interest of the American people.
Well, I would like to maybe challenge you if you really believe in promoting DEI. I've got about 20 seconds left. Then, in giving jobs to somebody based on their minority status or the color of their skin or their sexual proclivities, you might want to consider stepping down from your job and giving it to somebody who has more minority points than you do.
Well, if that were what
With that, I
DEI
yield.
is about,
My time
maybe
is
I would,
over.
but it's
I'm
not what
yielding.
it's about.
I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and my colleague from Texas did a very good job. Listen, the sky is falling. We hear it now, and not just in the DOGE subcommittee, but we hear it in Oversight from our friends across the aisle. The sky's falling. The world's going to end. People are going to die. And then when they say Elon Musk's name, it's never Elon Musk. It's Elon Musk. Reckless gutting of the federal workforce and this hyperbolic fear-mongering is brought to you by the American left. And why, I ask, and so many others, the DOGE committee Dems are using this, quite frankly, sloppy, lazy, wildly inaccurate, and really boring rhetoric. Because this administration and this president is finally acting boldly, because so many administrations in the past haven't. They're acting boldly and courageously to ensure, wait for it, that the American taxpayers' dollars fund federal workers that work. I know that may be a radical concept to some. Now, let's set the record straight as well. Secretary Rubio has made it sure. He'd issued a blanket waiver for any life-saving aid. I think it's $72 billion that we're spending. Is USAID the perfect vehicle for this aid? Of course not. We found that it isn't. And we also recognize that China has that Belt and Road Initiative, and they're licking their chops. And if we took that $72 billion out, they're going to fill that vacuum. So that's just hyperbolic nonsense that we do not recognize that there's a role to play for the United States in the federal aid space. But what we want to expose is $164 million going to radical organizations, $122 million of it to organizations that have aligned or at least tied to terrorists. So, Mr. Primorak, putting aside the massive issues of handing money over to terrorists and such, can you speak to other ways that our foreign aid has actually hurt United States efforts and interests to counter the malign influences, let's say, of the Chinese Communist Party?
Our aid has created an international aid dependency. It's become international welfare. We need to put terms on these programs. The whole point of this is to help strengthen countries economically, politically, and become strong allies. We don't do that when we celebrate 30, 40, 50 years in a place. That means we are failing. The point of our jobs is to work ourselves out of a job. If we do that, if we focus more on trade, if we focus more on investment, we're going to create the kind of allies in the developing world that'll make us stronger in combating the China challenge.
So you're talking about self-sufficiency, it sounds like. You're talking about taking a developing nation and helping it develop.
And that's what they want.
One of the countries that come to mind, for instance, that had a successful journey over the last 60 years is like a Singapore. They don't need foreign financial aid from the United States. They're a wealthy city-state now, are they not?
You had countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and other places that benefited. Look at them now.
Wild successes. Okay, so also, Mr. Premier, while I got you, do you know of if USAID sent any funding toward lab research in Wuhan, China?
Just what I've seen in the newspapers.
Yeah, clearly we shouldn't be sending our foreign aid to China when they're our greatest adversary. Ms. Jonker, thank you for being here. Just to follow up on some of the things that Mr. Gill was asking you, 2 million, and this is a source. This is from the Federal Award Identification Numbers, so this clearly happened on the USspending.gov website. $2 million to quote activity to strengthen trans-led organizations to deliver transgender surgeries. Do you think that's a good use of taxpayer money?
I defer to Congress, sir. If Congress appropriated the money
that's
and
not
was
what I
notified
asked.
about the program,
Mr.
then
Unger,
I
do you
believe
think
it's in the interest of the
do you
American
think it's a good
people.
use of taxpayer money?
I believe it's a good use of taxpayer money for Congress
That is
to
very
appropriate
telling.
funds.
Thank you. I yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. In closing, I want to thank our witnesses once again for their testimony today. And Chairman Comer was going to be here but got tied up. I now yield to the ranking member Stansbury for closing remarks.
All right. Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman. It's always a wild adventure here in the Oversight Committee. And as the language was just used, wild and sloppy is not what's happening in this committee, but what Elon Musk and Donald Trump are doing to our foreign affairs and foreign aid. And in fact, if my friends across the aisle would like to understand the real world impacts of the tens of thousands of Americans who've been laid off and the people who are suffering around the world, go home and talk to your own constituents, because we know they're coming to your town halls, and we know that behind closed doors, you are calling the president and you are calling secretaries and telling them that your constituents are upset and that you don't support what they're doing. So I do not appreciate you all sitting here pretending like this is not what you support, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the gutting of foreign aid and global realignment that's happening under Trump. They're dismantling this agency. They're withholding funds. They're firing tens of thousands of U.S. aid staff. They're hacking federal data systems. They're stranding aid workers across the world. International food aid is rotting in ports. American farmers have lost millions of dollars in income. And a global realignment with our foreign adversaries, including Vladimir Putin, is happening at a scale unlike anything we have seen in American history. And the administration knows that these activities are illegal. They know that they've overstepped their constitutional authority. They know they're violating statutory law. They know they're violating appropriations law. They know that they're violating federal employment laws. And they know that they are reversing American foreign policy in a way that we have never seen before. And Donald Trump and his allies are trying to redefine the Constitution by tweet. They're threatening federal judges, intimidating federal employees, and yes, even members of Congress using the Department of Justice. And why? We don't know, because not a single person from the administration has come here to testify in this committee or in any committee about what DOGE and Elon Musk are actually doing. And if you look at the so-called transparency that Elon Musk put online, the math does not add up. Talk about wild and sloppy. Our friends across the aisle like to talk about how he's some sort of genius. And this dude couldn't even post a simple spreadsheet that adds up. It's literally off by tens of billions of dollars. You guys, that's wild. I mean, like, literally, that's wild. But in spite of this, our friends across the aisle are acting like everything's normal. And yesterday, last night, they passed a budget resolution that not only is going to gut Medicaid and Medicare, but is going to make these cuts and federal firing permanent, even though they know it is making America less safe. And in the meantime, Elon Musk is actually awarding himself additional federal contracts. In fact, yesterday it was reported that he gave himself the FAA contract for communications. I mean, you guys, this is like graft, waste, fraud, abuse, all of the things. It's happening in front of your eyes, literally, and they are breaking the law while they cozy up to our foreign adversaries. And I know that Donald Trump thinks that he's a king because his social media, of course, he keeps repeating this. But let me say this to you, Mr. Trump. 250 years ago, the people of this great nation rejected a reckless, abusive king, and we won't go back. And for the thousands of federal workers out there, the aid workers, the advocates, and the people around the world who are impacted by these reckless and heartless and harmful and disgusting cuts that are impacting people across the world, know that we see you. We stand with you. We are fighting for you. We are in the courts. We are in Congress. We are in our communities, and we will hold this administration accountable. And we will not abandon our allies or our humanity. So with that, I say to all of you, be strong. We will fight back.
I now recognize myself for closing remarks. And threats against the President of the United States will not be tolerated by anyone. And the math does add up. The United States is $36 trillion in debt. $36 trillion. There's plenty of spreadsheets that show that. As a matter of fact, there's a debt clock. You can watch it continue to tick upwards every single day. In fiscal year 2024, the government spent over $1.8 trillion more than it took in. And in fiscal year 2025, the interest on our debt is expected to exceed $1 trillion. That's everybody. I don't care how you vote. The American people do not want to continue to fund these propaganda campaigns, regime changes, terrorist, LGBTQ initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and other Democrat globalist initiatives. And even if the people did want to continue supporting such causes, guess what? They can support them with their own money through private donations. Because the reality is, everyone, we are flat out broke. If the U.S. government operated like any other private business, which it should, by the way, it would be completely bankrupt and it would be out of business. Last year, we spent almost $2 trillion more than we took in. The United States government is not a charity, and it is not to be used and abused by the bureaucracy to implement the far left's agenda and impose it on the entire world. Again, 96% of all political contributions from USAID employees go to Democrat Party candidates or PACs. Perhaps that's why we're hearing all the complaining. The revolving door between USAID employees and NGOs that receive USAID funding is undeniable. Maybe we should consider investigating whether USAID funding has made it back to Democrat campaigns. Has it affected elections? The real questions the American people deserve to know answers to are these. Why are we funding 9 out of 10 news outlets in Ukraine? Why was former USAID Administrator Samantha Power visiting Hungary for the purpose of strengthening democratic institutions when Hungary is a country that is strongly democratic and members of the EU and NATO? Why was USAID co-funding joint programs with George Soros' Open Society to promote radical social agendas throughout the developing world? Why is USAID involved in the canceling of elections in Romania? Why is USAID involved in funding court changes in Albania that resulted in the prosecution of the Albanian opposition leader? Why is USAID funding censorship laws in Brazil to silence Bolsonaro? Why is USAID involved in funding the Syrian civil war? What we have learned here today is that USAID has been used as a tool by Democrats to brainwash the world with globalist propaganda to force regime changes around the world. But if USAID funded terrorism that resulted in the death of Americans, then this committee will be making criminal referrals. Lastly, if this is the funding that has come from the USAID, the United States Agency for International Development needs to be abolished. With that and without objection, all members have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. If there is no further business without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.